Time for convening has arrived, so we will start this evening's series of meetings, opening with our work session. And the first item is the presentation of the tree canopy study. Ms. Lawler.
Great. Good evening, Mayor and City Council. We are presenting our tree canopy study this evening. The data is from the summer of 2021, which seems a little late, but we will go through that a bit as well. So usually in the past we have used imagery that was acquired by the National Agricultural Imagery Program, also called NAEP. In 2021, the data was collected in November, which meant there were no leaves on the trees at that point. So we had to make some adjustments, and we were able to acquire satellite imagery instead. The time frame was similar. It was June and August of 2021. We had to combine the two images because the north end and the panhandle had some clouds, but we were able to pull the data together and create one seamless layer in order to do the study. We also this year took a new approach and used NearMap, and they provide AI vegetation data. And so we were using that to compare our study of how we've done it in the past with their layer as well. And if you remember from previous years, with the traditional classification, we take the aerial image and we classify. So we'll say, for example, the blue areas are not canopy, so no tree coverage. The green areas are tree coverage, and then we have all these other pixels that are remaining in yellow, and those are ones that we don't know. So we run through, we group the pixels again, reclassify them. We go through this process several times until we finally come up with one layer that is canopy or not canopy. The advantage of the AI data is we have the imagery from NearMap, and then we load in their AI-generated vegetation. Much faster, and gives us an opportunity to do more analytical studies as opposed to just classifying a whole bunch of pixels. We're able to take advantage of the vendor's experience in creating models and running the algorithms that way. From the city scale, there's not much difference in the traditional, the ISO unsupervised classification versus the AI-generated data. And then also from the margin of error and the percent accuracy, we found that the AI data was more accurate. The margin of error was smaller. And when we used our random QC points, the 2021 with our pixel classification, that was an accuracy of 90.1, whereas the AI data using the same points, we came up with greater than 95% accuracy. So what that meant was in those points where NearMap classified an area as canopy or not canopy, we agreed with that at a much higher accuracy level. Comparing the two data sets, so on the ISO unsupervised, which is our traditional method, this is over at Lake Forest Elementary School. You can see in the blue, that is the pixel classification. So it's a little bit splotchy. If you look closely, especially around the field, that kind of makes a backwards L. It doesn't seem to pick up the trees in that area as well, whereas the AI data captures it much more fully. And if we overlay the two, and I apologize, I have my AI and ISO unsupervised colors flipped, but the green is the AI data, and then the splotchy blue is the ISO unsupervised. So again, the AI data captures the canopy more fully. We feel more accurately as well. And if we compare Sandy Springs across other cities in the metro Atlanta area, we're looking at a 55 to 58% canopy, depending on whether we're looking at the ISO classification or the artificial intelligence data. Brookhaven recently completed a study also in 2021, so their number is very new at 48%. Most of the other studies are a couple years old. With the AI data, we did a bit more analyses this year, and so we looked at the 100-foot stream corridor, so 50 feet on either side of the stream line. And in Crooked Creek, we had a percent canopy of 79.8%, Long Island Creek 80.5%, Marsh Creek 68.7%, and Nancy Creek 74.9%. And we want to note that even though there are areas that are not canopy covered, it doesn't mean that it's pervious. So it's not something that's necessarily concrete or a house or a structure. A lot of that was standing water, as you can see in this area up here. It may also be low vegetation also, so marshy, sort of grassy lands. That does not come up in the tree canopy. And so then we also looked at each council district. So this is the AI canopy acreage for each council district as compared to the council district size. Council District 1 has a percent canopy of 61%, Council District 2, 53%, as well as Council District 3, 53%. District 4 has a 45% canopy, District 5, a 48%, and District 6, a 63%. So the overall citywide percent canopy, we're looking at 55%. And now we go into a bit deeper analyses. And so what we're looking at here is for each zone within each council district, the percent canopy. And so if we were to look at the residential estate, so RE in District 1, on average, that's 67% canopy across those zones within that council district. If we go all the way down Council District 1, the total number, 61%. So throughout Council District 1, the percent canopy is 61%. If we go across, so taking RE again, for the entire city, RE is generally 65% canopy coverage. There are some areas of the city that do not have zoning. That's going to be the right-of-way. And there is, and as well as the Chattahoochee River and Bull Sluice, there is still trees or there is canopy that comes over that. Some of it originates within the no zoning area. Sometimes, though, the tree stump, the tree trunk, may be in the RE lot, but the canopy goes over the right-of-way. So that's where we account for having canopy within a no zoning area. So hopefully short and sweet. The canopy we're looking at between 55 and 58%. My recommendation is that we focus on the 55% with the AI data. We feel that the data is more accurate. It allows us more time to do more in-depth analyses. The AI data seems to be getting better each year that they're generating their new algorithms. We don't have to wait as long for the data from the National Agriculture Department because the AI data is generated pretty quickly from when the imagery is captured. Is there any questions?
All right. Any questions about the canopy study? Mr. Paulson.
Thank you. The last table is interesting, and you would think it's obvious the office zoning is going to have less trees than the residential, so that seems to make sense. Can we go back and analyze 5 years ago with the AI technology? Because the first impression, if one just looks superficially, is that we've somehow lost 3 to 4 or 5% of canopy in the last 5 years, which I'm suspicious of that being the case. But is there a way to go back and apply AI technology to 4 years ago to just see what the AI technology percentage would be then.
I can ask the vendor if they provide that. They definitely have the aerial imagery or the satellite imagery for that. I can see if they have that available and if they could generate it.
That'd be interesting to know,
Okay.
as long as it doesn't cost too much money.
Ms. Mueller.
So first, I want to say thank you so much for breaking it out by district. I know that's something that I was very interested in seeing, and also by the zoning classification. But one of the questions I have is that there are certain areas that are not going to be impacted by human intervention, right, or action. So anything that's park conservation could have pests and disease, and then therefore we have loss of canopy. But in other areas where we're having development, is there a way, now that we have the full view and we have the data, to pull out by the chart that you had by district that would show that part of the canopy that we would have some sort of a way to know if our tree policy is, in our building code, are we working to help the canopy? Are we taking away from the canopy, or is it neutral? So is there a way to take that out to say that, so for instance, District 3 is 53%, but of that, making this number up, 40% would be something to focus on, and are we going up or down because because of our development code?
And so that would be combining some of the zones.
So I'm not. I don't know if I know parks and I know conservation wouldn't necessarily have a residential development going into it unless it was rezoned. But maybe there are other things that need to be grouped in there. So I'm not the expert to know what should be grouped together that we can't impact to take out. That's just a question. I think that would be interesting.
We can definitely group different parts of land together, and we just need to figure out kind of what the criteria is to group. Similar to how we group District 1, the council districts, or how we group the zoning. So if there's other ways or other criteria in order to group and then to pull out the canopy within those, it's just a simple way of taking the data and the groups and then what the canopy is overlaying over those.
And then what are the next steps? Because you mentioned at the end, your conclusion to go forward with the analytics. So will the process continue and you'll come back to council with more information?
So generally, we do the canopy study every 2 years. So ideally, my plan is to purchase the canopy coverage for 2023, do another canopy study. Ideally, it won't take over 2 years to come back to you all with the results. And then it also sounds like Councilmember Paulson is interested in maybe looking at 5 years back, so providing that. So if there's other groupings, we need to, we can definitely do it. I just need a little bit of guidance, whether it's from zoning with Ginger or sustainability on other ways, other areas to group the data.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Rochelle.
So in District 4 and 5, do we need to plant more trees, or do we just have more houses and commercial space, or?
I think that's going to be a Catherine and Willie sort of response on that one. So of what the policy is going to be moving forward, or suggestions on that.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. So as Bridget mentioned, this is the first time that we really have the manpower to go into the details and also the data as well. So we will continue to analyze the information that we have. We're really using this year as a baseline, but we're going to start looking into how can we establish some policy, if there's areas that we can prioritize for tree plantings. However, we always need to be cognizant of the different nature of each area, and therefore it might be difficult to put more trees in a significant manner in, for example, the perimeter area. But we will definitely take a look at that. We will also follow up with a canopy study report. We had drafted one last year, but it was very basic. So moving forward this year and in the future, we're going to have a solid report that will go really into all the details of the analyses that we are conducting.
Mr. Baumann.
Thank you. Great report. I've been looking at these for 9-10 years now, and we've been asking for slicing and dicing, and you've done that. I think I'll just follow up on Melissa's, Councilwoman Millar's. I think, in a nutshell, to carve out our our parkland, right? That's stuff that, will expand, it will contract, but less related to sort of human intervention. And to see, using this baseline, I mean, we can go back. I agree, I wouldn't spend a lot of money on that, but now that we have a baseline, as policymakers, I mean, we've seen with our own eyes what the trends are, and we can go back. But on a going forward basis, the very specifically, and Melissa, if I'm misinterpreting what you're saying, is to make sure we have an ability to carve out. It's interesting by district, and also I note that the districts have changed, so I'm not sure whether this predated or has the new districts.
So these are the old districts because it was from 2021.
Got it.
The data was from, so
Well,
moving forward, we'll have new districts, you're right.
Yeah, that's right. But we do have national parks that could skew, right? They could be even, or they could grow, or depending on the dates. What is of keen interest is what's happening in our human-managed, developed, controlled areas. So that's what I'd like to see going forward. But thank you very much.
Great.
Mr. DiGiulio.
Bridget,
Yes.
what effect is all of this? We have got these major roads that go right through Sandy Springs. And I mean, they take up an awful lot of space, an awful lot of acreage, and an awful lot of construction right now. What effect are these highways and the constructions process that's been going on forever, and looks like it's going to continue to go on forever? What effect are they having on our tree canopy?
So on the tree canopy, yeah, you're right. They're definitely decreasing the canopy in where they're taking expanding the right of way, knocking down the trees. And I think, so yesterday we had a vendor come in, and it kind of goes along with what you're asking. And we were able to ride with them, and in the vehicle, so it's kind of like the Google vehicles with the camera on top, and they were using LiDAR data in order to capture so from the ground level, not necessarily from the satellite level or from the aerial level. And then they brought the data back in, and we could see they had a number of metrics. Of like, all right, here's these trees. This is how much area of gaseous pollutants that these trees can absorb, and it basically gave a buffer around the tree, and they have some sort of algorithm for that. And so in terms of like clean air, and I think it would be great to use that that's another technology, in order to capture the data to show, okay, so these trees on this sidewalk are providing this area in terms of cooling down the temperature along the sidewalk and in that right-of-way area. It's also using it for cleaning the air in terms of taking out the carbon dioxide from the vehicles. So I think carbon monoxide. Anyways, and so there's, in addition to how the development is affecting our canopy, I think we also want to start looking at how the canopy, the loss or the growth, or where the canopy is located, affects other sorts of quality of life within the community. So that's another direction that I think would be great to go down with our analysis.
Anybody else? Dr. Kelly.
I feel like you may have touched on this, but I have an interest in whether this technology can be leveraged to better understand tree planting capacity around which is kind of what we touched on, but not so much, not necessarily replacing what's been lost, but just opportunity. It's the opportunity itself for what, and it sounds like you're saying that.
And I think, right, and some of it goes to zoning, but also a big part of it is what part of the land we have the opportunity to plant. We can't really just go into private people's properties and plant. And so, yeah, we need to figure out how much area we as a city can plant. You're right.
And that's something that this technology can help with if we explore those kind of questions.
We should be able to look into that.
What it sounds like. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you for the report. I think Councilman Paulson's concern about changing a methodology, producing different results, we don't really have a way to compare the accuracy of previous ones as we have done here. So if there's some way of understanding methodologically how we can compare, using a tree metaphor, apples and oranges, it would be helpful to understand. I know we have, to Mr. DiGiulio's point, we have lost canopy due to the construction. We lose canopy every time we have a storm, and trees come down, and power lines go out. And just the natural life and death of a tree. I've probably had 5 trees fall on my property in the last 2 years. I'm trying my best to plant them, but they're not going to produce the canopy that the old trees planted. So it's a dynamic situation that we face. But as long as we're kind of within a reasonable set of parameters in preservation and enhancement of canopy, I think that's a reasonable goal that we ought to be shooting for. But thank you for the presentation.
Thank you.
All right. Speaking of trees, Mr. Park, come talk to us about tree fund uses.
Mayor, City Council, thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation about potential tree fund uses and expenditures. So I want to start off this presentation by going over the existing language in our development code. Please take note of the language in bold. Essentially, it says that funds maintained in the tree bank can be used to replace tree canopy or preserve tree canopy. That is the extent of the current language, and due to those limitations of loose language, it does not truly let us go forward and spend these funds as needed. And so this policy is here to set forth clear guidelines for what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. So to go over the current uses, we obviously have our tree planting initiatives. Our main tree planting initiative is through city projects, public works, parks, and facilities. We're obviously trying to plant where we can, when we can, and where it is appropriate. Furthermore, we have a wonderful partnership with Trees Atlanta and the 1 Million Trees Initiative that allows us to plant in the right-of-way and front yard trees. Please note that the front yard trees must be within a certain amount of distance from a public street so that they may administer public good, right? Use for the public in terms of shade and other ecosystem services. Other uses include survey and the maintenance plan of public trees, including right-of-way trees, trees in our parks and facilities, invasive species control in public parks. Please note that the invasive species control only includes plant invasive species. We are not currently actively looking to limit or proactively stop invertebrate, macroinvertebrate pests. So that includes pine beetles, emerald ash borer, and the pervasiveness of that spongy moth and the spotted lanternfly, which is coming down south. Furthermore, we have community education initiatives, and my position is currently funded from the tree fund. Here are the limitations to this current tree fund usage. We are running out of space, or we have very limited space for new plantings. Along the right-of-way, we have to make sure there aren't conflicts with utilities or line of sight for safety for pedestrians and motor vehicles. Our existing parks have been infilled near to capacity. We do not want to limit the recreational use of our green spaces, and so we have to expend space for soccer fields, ballparks, and just general kick a ball around, throw a ball around, have a picnic. We want to make sure our residents have enough space for that. Furthermore, we cannot sacrifice the existing recreational infrastructure such as playgrounds and buildings. A major limitation is the fact that we cannot currently acquire material other than trees. Not just trees, but we have been pretty limited to overstory large canopy trees. And lastly, we cannot conduct work on private property generally. When I say generally, obviously we have the ability to plant in front yards due to the front yard tree program with Trees Atlanta. Here are our uses for consideration. Before we go into that, I want to talk about the strategies. This is the strategy that informed and drove this policy. We want to start doing more active canopy management. Instead of being reactive, we want to identify the pain points and be able to address issues before they become a larger problem in the future. This is a more efficient and economical way to manage our forests. We also wish to further engage community stakeholders and so that the responsibility and benefits are shared. If you go look at the tree ordinances or tree policies in other major municipalities, they always quote that the public-private partnership is where success is had. That is why in the city of Atlanta, Trees Atlanta has had the success that they had, because they have large amounts of public buy-in. Furthermore, we want to continue to expand the canopy, especially in areas where it is low. That is where the canopy report in depth has been extremely vital and useful in our management and future planting plans. So here are our staff recommendations. Number 1, forest restoration. Obviously, we want to expand the canopy, but we want to ensure that the current canopy does not diminish even further. So we want to make sure we proactively manage it and have a tree or plant healthcare program that will limit the future loss and increase the vitality and the rigor of our existing beautiful forests. 2, proactive pest insect management. This kind of ties in with forest restoration. As our forests are maturing after the Georgia Land Lottery and we have begun to build this city, there are a lot of stands that have been unmanaged. These pine forests are becoming to maturity and they're starting to age out and get sick. Sick trees attract pests. And if we don't want to have one tree attract many pests affecting a major stand, we need to be proactive and really address these pest insect issues. We wish to continue to look for, identify, and discuss conservation property acquisitions to permanently preserve as perhaps a conservation zoned area. Other programs that we are looking at are landmark tree protection programs, private canopy expansion programs, and community canopy expansion programs. These last 3 programs that I mentioned is a part of that public-private partnership where the city is seeking to drive more private initiative on private land so that stakeholders may take part in managing our natural resources. So first off, we have forest restoration. So what does that really mean? Active management of the existing forest by stabilizing the soil to control erosion. You know, when we think about a forest, we think about everything above the ground, the pieces of broccoli that sprout up. However, the root structure in the soil is where it truly begins, much like the foundation of a house. We have to go in, do some fact-finding, and see how we can replenish the soil by planting understory trees, shrubs, and ground covers to lay a proper foundation so that our current and future forests may thrive. A project example may include after we remove invasive plants, we can plant trees, but we also need to plant the associated fauna and flora that will help the success of this forest. A great analogy is perhaps when you build a building, the trees are the scaffolding. The large canopy trees are the roof. But the ground cover, the shrubs, and the understory trees provide the actual faculties that a proper healthy forest need to survive. Especially in our steep sloped areas along the stream banks and the river corridor, if we do not properly manage those areas, the storms and the erosion will simply reduce the land available for planting, thus further diminishing the canopy. 2, proactive pest insect management. We are seeking, and I am currently developing an action plan. It's called an Integrated Pest Management Plan that prioritizes mechanical removal over chemical intervention. Obviously, we have many sensitive areas in the city of Sandy Springs, and we want to actively manage these areas. Again, we want to integrate pest management strategies, limiting the use of pesticides, but also setting economic damage thresholds so that we are not spending from the tree fund unreasonably, but calculating a formula that tells us at this level is where we need to start taking action. We don't have to address every single pain point, but rather address the wound itself. 3, conservation property acquisition. Obviously, a great way to preserve canopy is simply by setting it aside from future development or modification. And so we seek to purchase property that has a heavy canopy coverage, perhaps an old growth forest or areas with extremely sensitive habitat. To limit the large expenditures from the tree fund, we are seeking to make sure that those costs do not exceed 25% of the tree fund or a dollar cap of $250,000. Any of these purchases would obviously require the permission and approval of mayor and council. 4, there is the Landmark Tree Protection Program. This language was presented before, but I will go over it again. This was presented and developed at the request of the city arborist. There are a lot of people that are seeking for permits to remove trees, landmark trees as defined by the Development Code and the Technical Manual, that could otherwise be saved with maintenance. The definitions of such trees that are qualified for this program are on the screen. And the most important part is that the owners must submit an assessment and management plan signed off by a certified arborist, and that they are willing to match our funds 1-to-1 up to $1,000 per property per 3 years. The priorities obviously would be trees that provide additional and exceptional ecosystem services, such as stream buffer stabilization or trees that shade public property. A great example of this are private homes along parks that are run by the city, whose trees actually provide great services to the public using our parks. That would be a priority landmark tree that we would wish to protect, as it provides great good for the public. We also have the private canopy expansion program. Now, this is for private landowners for plantings on private property that are below coverage requirement. The requirements are right there on the screen: 35% for residential and 40% for non-residential. Residential and non-residential lands are eligible, which means commercial properties could also potentially apply for this program to receive funds for preservation. The owner, again, must submit a planting plan and a management plan signed off by an ISA certified arborist, and must be willing to match 1-to-1 up to $2,000 per property per 3 years. Priorities include areas that will increase the canopy coverage, and again, properties that are adjacent to public land or in sensitive areas. Going on next to the community canopy program. This was developed at the request of a local organization, and this is for nonprofits or 401cs that seek to do community initiatives, projects that expand and protect the canopy, generate public benefit, and obviously align with the goals of the Next 10 Comprehensive Plan. Much like the previous program, we are looking for a 1-to-1 match up to $3,000 per organization or project per year. Priorities include high canopy increase, property adjacent to public land or in sensitive areas, and obviously high-profile projects that would increase the status and the beautification of our great city. So just to go over one last time the staff recommendations: number 1 being forest restoration and that active management; 2, proactive pest insect management; 3, conservation property acquisition; and 4, the community buy-in programs such as the Landmark Tree Protection Program, Private Canopy Program, and the Community Canopy Program. These are all designed to increase that private-public engagement to increase public stakeholder buy-in. Thank you.
Mr. Park, thank you very much, and you've addressed some of my greatest concerns with our tree policy. Oftentimes, we can't see the forest for the tree. Mm-hmm. And by that I mean we get so focused on saving one individual tree that we happen to fall in love with or whatever, and that's a good thing, but we're neglecting the overall health of the forest.
That's right.
And that's been a concern of mine from the very beginning, and you're filling in some of those gaps nicely. We don't do enough about understory trees and shrubs at ground level, and we've also got some areas where our soil is not really good for growing trees that we need some mitigation for, particularly in some of our stream bank areas. We've had problems preserving and planting new trees in some of the stream banks because of the sediment coming down from stream carrying various
pollutants and whatnot.
Pollutants and everything else, and it makes it very difficult to replace the tree canopy in some of these areas. I had personal experience with that. So I think you're filling in a lot of the gaps that I've been concerned about. So thank you. Are there any questions? Ms. Mueller.
So, thank you, Willie. Question on the forest restoration. Mm-hmm. So what areas would you think that would be prioritized? I know we have the Chattahoochee Natural Recreation Area. We have some land within their boundaries, but we also have John Ripley Forbes Big Trees Preserve. So are those areas, I'm just trying to understand, where would you see these efforts focused?
Of course. The forest restoration efforts come in twofold. In our public lands along the stream buffers, where it's very sensitive, like big trees, like Crooked Creek Park, especially along parks in Ridgeview where there's a large watershed. The second part is people don't necessarily consider the entire city a part of the urban forest. Places in the right-of-way or those planting strips and islands have been neglected. The soil is not suitable for the continued growth and flourishment of trees. A great example of this would be along Glen Ridge Connector. All that construction happening there with all the construction equipment being parked, that leads to great soil compaction. If we lose those trees, the people stuck in traffic there will be subject to a lot of sun, right, and a lot of harsh eye strain. And so forest restoration includes these areas as well, along Roswell, along all these major thoroughways, because these are the connectors that the people use. As much as I love the forest in the center of a beautiful protected area, what really generates the most benefit for the public? And so I want to make sure that we manage the forest in the parks and the natural forest, but also within our natural urban forest as well.
A couple more questions. Do you envision that we would work with groups like the Nature Conservancy on the acquisition of the property that you're talking about? I mean, that's a national group that I know other cities have partnered with.
Yeah, the Nature Conservancy, the Georgia Conservancy, and a lot of other private public organizations do help with the acquisition of these properties. But from my own current assessment and audit of available properties, the price of this land is extremely expensive, and the ability for the city to negotiate with private landowners is limited to the fact that the prices are very high. We want to make sure that if we do acquire property, that it is belonging to the city of Sandy Springs and not eased off to another organization. We are currently exploring partnerships that are potential and have the ability to acquire these lands, but again, it's a slow process to identify and then also find a landowner willing to sell that land to us and not to another developer for a much higher price.
Okay. Thank you.
Any others? Mr. DiGiulio.
I have a question about our partnership with Trees Atlanta. My district is District 5. Glen Ridge Drive goes through there. And over the last 2 years, along the right-of-way, there's been a tremendous number of plantings being done there, of trees being placed between the sidewalk and the street. I remember growing up that a lot of times when trees mature, one of the things they do is lift the sidewalks.
Yes.
And lift the streets because the roots get out under there. And I'm wondering that if we're doing that, if we're not causing ourselves problems 10 and 15 years down the road where we got to get Public Works to come in there and clean up this mess and take out these roots and replace these sidewalks. And if we're not doing ourselves long-term more harm than we are good.
This is an amazing point that a lot of people fail to recognize. Other cities, when they do tree planting projects, they don't do a true assessment of what that tree will impact that surrounding area. The trees that Trees Atlanta select, along with the guidance of city staff, myself, and the sustainability manager, we choose trees that have been studied and proven to not have a major effect on the surrounding pavement, concrete, or sidewalk. Furthermore, in areas that may pose a great risk to tree root infiltration, no matter what the species is, moving forward, we are going to be using root barriers, which are specialized plastic guards that go 4 to 5 feet under the ground. That can help move and shape tree roots away from existing infrastructure. Yes, sir. The last thing I want to do is plant a tree now that causes problems in 50 years. The work that we do is truly not for us today or not even for my kids, but it's for their grandkids. And so if we are not deliberate and intentional interactions, we are setting ourselves up for future failure.
Thank you.
Mr. Baumann.
Thank you, and I want to echo the mayor's remarks. I think it's really great to see, first of all, you're a breath of fresh air, no pun intended, but that's the goal. And I think having a comprehensive plan to manage the tree canopy, but also everything that goes along with that is something that will benefit for years to come. And I want to also help frame the question that's really before us. I think nobody's going to, I think we're all going to support fully the comprehensive plan. I think the question, though, is to what extent the tree fund pays for the items that are on this list. I mean, all of these things, independent of whether the tree fund pays or not, are worthy and consistent with our adopted priorities of sustainability and conservation, and I think the uniform support for effectively a green city. So it is entirely consistent to say, hey, we support that, but where does the money come from? Does it come from the tree fund, which is funded by loss of canopy, or can that also be supplemented? I don't want anybody to think, at least as it relates to my view, that we are constrained by what the tree fund has. And really, to Councilman Paulson's question earlier, I think one of the really good ways to measure loss of canopy as it directly relates to development code, at least as a base minimum, is how much money is coming into the tree fund, right? That as a minimum, right? I mean, trees are being lost due to human actions, development, and otherwise, and we're also losing a ton of canopy to the GDOT and roads projects. But as it relates to the development code, zoning, and our ordinances, the tree fund's a pretty good metric for, at least from a comparison from year to year, to see how much loss is occurring. So presumably if we have a lot of dollars coming in a year, there's been a lot of loss. And if there's a low amount of dollars, either they're not doing their job or there's not been as much loss. And I think that's a really good way to measure it. So I do want to be careful to separate the issue of uniform support for a comprehensive policy that you've outlined with your great presentation skills and expertise, and then what comes out of the tree fund. So along those, and I'm concerned about a slippery slope of utilizing, keep in mind that those funds have come in directly from loss of canopy, that I'm not saying we only plant, I mean, we purposefully had a policy, this was not by accident, because I think we can go back to times in our past, including while I was on council and then even preceding my time on council, where tree fund money was being used for city landscape projects. And I think we agreed that that wasn't really the case of what we wanted to do. We were losing canopy. It wanted to go to canopy. So with that in mind, I would like to, since this is a work session, implore us to think about two specific areas. I would be really cautious about, given the amount of cost and what comes into the tree fund, about using the tree fund for property acquisition. We don't, I mean, any given year, it's not like the tree fund's getting millions of dollars a year. So I'd be very, very cautious about that. I mean, I think the council can always vote, any council, this or the future, to do that. But as a policy, I'd be very, very cautious about that. So I really want to think about that. And then the second thing is the position that you occupy. I absolutely support it 100%. And in fact, we did have a lot of money in the tree fund, and there was some expedience and uncertainty coming out of COVID with budgetary funds. So supporting this position from the fund was fine. I mean, I think we were, correct me if I'm wrong, Tony, we were over $1 million in the fund when we agreed to it. But our run rate is not $1 million. So without getting into the specifics of the staffing, I would be cautious and want our colleagues, and I've discussed this with some other colleagues on the council, to impose a cap, some guardrails, if you will, on how much not extraneous, but how much of the staffing cost, for example, would be used. And I'm just going to throw out, because the general fund can be used for these costs too, right? I mean, all of this is going to cost more than, if we do all of this in a big way, like I think a lot of us might want to do, it's going to cost more than the tree fund's generating. We're talking about a couple $100,000 a year. So I'm going to, between now and when we adopt it, I just want to throw out for consideration some concept where the fund will have some split, 50-50, that's pulling from thin air, with the general fund, and provided that the fund maintains certain minimum amounts so that not all of the funds are going towards staffing, because again, we're trying to replace and protect tree canopy. Every one of these things is good. A lot of it would be worthy. So between now and when I'm sorry? Oh.
I just moved my microphone.
Oh, okay, good. So between now and when we adopt it, we want to look at some guardrails and caps on how we spend.
All right. Anybody else? Mr. Paulson.
I'll be quick. So are you guys going to come back to us with modifications to the current tree ordinance wording to try to include some of this stuff? Is that why we're talking about this? Because the tree ordinance right now is pretty limited in what it says we can do. Is that one of the goals here, to come back with recommendations?
So currently, this tree fund policy is designed to work within the current tree ordinance. The reason being is the rewriting of a tree ordinance takes many, many months, if not years, and a lot of funding to pay for consultants, right? And so this is a current use under the current language.
Okay.
And of course, if there is a tree ordinance rewrite in the future, we would revise this to reflect those changes, and we would re-present it to mayor and council for your consideration.
So right now, this, what you're recommending here, is already allowed in the tree fund as a viable use in the tree fund. Okay. So the other question I've got was the proactive pest insect management. I've been reading stories that there's these insects coming in from the north that are the insects are coming to get us. Okay. But isn't there somebody else studying this stuff as well? Let's make sure we don't study in a vacuum, because I'm sure the state of Georgia is looking at this stuff as well. Let's make sure we get as much information as we can from everybody before we make any recommendations on what we should do. So that's just an observation.
Yeah. This tree fund policy was submitted to the Georgia Forestry Commission, to the Department of Natural Resources, and to the UGA Warnell School of Forestry for consideration. I got their feedback and incorporated those things into this policy. The reason being is there has been spotted lanternfly spotted in North Carolina and is slowly moving down south. Spotted lanternfly, that is one of the major macroinvertebrate pests, and their host plant, or the plant they rely on to reproduce, is tree of heaven. It's a small weedy tree that if you break it open, it smells like rotten peanut butter. Actually, it's a fun little fact. But we have an initiative to all of our contractors. I've taught them how to identify, and we are removing these things proactively. And so truly, I am not writing this in a vacuum, but I am using my experience from academia to get the right sources, references, and the peer-reviewed process before I would present anything to you guys for consideration.
Anybody else? Dr. Kelly.
Thank you. And you kind of touched on this, you talked about some of the peer-reviewed information, particularly as it relates to any sort of chemical interventions. I think we'd like to maybe see some of that, or at least I would, particularly as it relates to long-term impact.
Yes.
One of the questions I have, I think we've passed a few emails, we talked about tree injections, and so one of the questions I have about tree injections and a few of the other interventions that we may be thinking about is there a need, what happens if we stop doing it? Like, does a dependency develop if we start to use these chemicals and we stop for whatever reason? Maybe, fiscal reasons, who knows? So I just, particularly as it relates to the chemical stuff, I'd like us to be a little bit thoughtful, or be able to answer some of those questions before doing it. Yeah.
Yes, of course. The chemical interventions that are being proposed through this, and I can send a long-form report of the proposed chemical interventions, have actually been peer-reviewed and published through science journals for their efficacy and their long-term efficiency and their lack of long-term residue. The half-life of these chemicals tend to last around 3 to 5 years per treatment, and simply when that treatment is gone, the tree is not more susceptible, but it returns to the baseline susceptibility to those pests. Now, in an ideal world, if we create a buffer zone in our city, there may be a lag time where the insects may not return for some time because there is suitable space elsewhere. But if we stop intervention and we allow it to continue and go away, perhaps those problems may return. And again, that would be passing the buck to the next person, but while I am here, I would like to make sure that our forest is properly managed to the highest standard and quality that Sandy Springs deserves and respects.
Yeah, thank you. So I guess one of my concerns, and I've only just started kind of looking into this, like for example, one of the insecticides, we were looking at the infusible, transectin fusible insecticide. I'm having trouble finding anything that, and I may just need to look further, but anything that predates 2019 on it.
So the Rainbow Ecoscience vendor, which would be supplying these chemical interventions, these are newly developed, kind of cutting-edge treatments. And so they were not developed until that time.
That's what causes me a little bit of...
Yeah, and of course...
That's what gives me a little bit of grief.
Of course, there is that kind of that lack of runway, right? But if we look at industry standards and the premier tree care companies across Atlanta, such as Caldwell Tree Care and Davey Resource and Tree Experts, they also use these chemical interventions on a large scale. The city already holds a contract with Davey Resource Company for these interventions, and they have been doing this across the city to great effect.
I'm sorry, what city was that?
City of Atlanta and the City of Sandy Springs.
Okay.
City of Sandy Springs has a contract with Davey Resource Group.
Okay, cool. Before we pull out some of these newer chemicals, I wouldn't mind just waiting to see, what happens in some other cities, just in case.
I totally understand.
Just in case. It's only 4 years old, so.
Right. Anybody else?
Mayor, I have one quick question for Kristen. Kristen, as a posture, aren't we, in fact, looking to update the use? The comprehensive plan is one thing, but aren't we looking to clarify the tree fund policy with some action by the council, or are you just informing us?
Yes, so this will come back before you for you all to approve of an official policy.
Okay, would you circulate the language
We will.
as soon as possible? All right, thank
Absolutely.
you.
All right, anybody else? All right, Mr. Park, excellent presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mayor and City Council.
Ms. Sotal, ready to talk about the development code?
Good evening, Mayor and City Council. Tonight's presentation summarizes at a high level our in-depth review and proposed modifications of our development code. If you recall, this was an action item in our community work program, which is a critical component of the next 10, the city's comprehensive plan. We believe that these proposed amendments reflect the changes in our community and align with the city's goals for growth and development. We started this process last October, and since then have conducted public outreach consisting of numerous listening sessions, stakeholder meetings, and work sessions. On November 13th of this year, we will conduct our Planning Commission public hearing, and then on December 15th, we will be back here to present to Mayor and City Council, seeking approval of our final draft of the Development Code text amendments. Tonight, we have Christy Dodson from Code Studio to take you through the presentation.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. If we'll go to do I have a clicker? Yes, I do. I'm Christy Dodson. I'm from Code Studio. I've spoken before you a few times, so glad to be back. What I'm going to try to do tonight is strike a balance. This gets in the weeds fairly quickly, so I'm going to try to keep this at a fairly high-level overview of some of the key critical changes that we've talked about previously. Please feel free to stop and ask questions because, again, these do get pretty in the weeds. So anything that you need clarification on or want to discuss further, please feel free to interrupt me because, once we get through this, we'll be jumping from subject to subject. So it may make sense just to sort of pause after each slide, see if anybody has any feedback. Does that make sense to you all? Great. So we'll start with protected neighborhoods. We're taking a very light touch in what we're doing in protected neighborhoods. So a couple of the key updates in the conservation district, we're adding some setbacks. There weren't building setbacks there previously, so adding some building setbacks to the conservation district. One of the key updates is allowing some garages to encroach in the primary street, that's the front setback, and there's some pretty specific criteria for that. So the garage would have to be existing as of 2005. So that has to be something that's already built in place. It really is meant for people that have smaller garages that may have been built with ranch homes to be able to expand those because it's a common issue as cars have gotten larger. And that would allow for one garage door to be street facing, but any additional garage doors would need to be either side or rear facing. So it limits the visibility of that front facing garage. Yeah.
So when we put these in, is there going to be any kind of specifications for how long they could be? I mean, so conceivably, is someone going to build this big 60-foot or 100-foot bay in front of their house, but yet it fits into their property? I mean, we're going to have something that's going to limit that?
Yeah, so we are proposing that there will be a limit to how far that can encroach in the front setback. So there will be a limit to how close it could be to the front property line, so almost like a secondary garage front setback, and then also how far in front of that main facade that it can be. So it tries to get at it both ways.
So we wouldn't build like this big, long,
That's
where you
right.
can park like
Yeah,
8
like some
cars in
stable
there.
situation. Yeah, you
Okay.
wouldn't be able to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Ms.
Yeah.
Rochelle.
It says one garage door. Can it be a double garage door?
That would
Or
be
is-
a single
So
garage
just one
door.
single garage door. So we should put single garage door probably on
Yeah,
there.
the code will
Okay.
be clear on that point. It's a good point.
Anybody else? Continue.
Great. A couple of things on transitions and walls. I do apologize, the two second points are swapped for the headings. The first, protected neighborhood transition. So that's your transition from a protected neighborhood to a higher intensity district. There are some instances where we would like to give the director some discretion of that pre-prescribed transition, and those are primarily on sites that have some sort of environmental sensitive areas, or areas that have significant topography. So it may be that more intense district is very far down and the protected neighborhood is much higher up. And so that transition just may need to look a little different. Another that is related to that has to do with the grading setback, that grading setback mitigation zone. So that would allow for a moderate amount of disturbance in that allowed encroachment for essentially a reasonable construction entrance. So folks are having some issues and they're accessing the rear yard for construction because of that. So it gives the director some ability to allow for that as long as mitigation is provided. So we want to make sure that any land that is disturbed, there is a mitigation that's associated with that.
Can you explain mitigation, a little bit more of the why in the mitigation?
Yeah, so that really gets into your...
What's the problem we're solving specifically?
It's essentially erosion control. So when you're doing construction, you're getting that dirt and it's could erode into your watersheds, into your streams. And so we want to make sure that that erosion control is handled both during construction, but then there are also standards for either resodding or some sort of mitigation to make sure that soil doesn't erode down into your streams.
So just to be clear, what additional disturbance are we, I mean, what's the additional disturbance we're allowing? Is it in rear setbacks, any setback?
It would essentially be in side yards. So that would allow an excavator essentially to get down a side yard into somebody's rear yard. So it would be limited in width, and the administrator would have some discretion to make sure that that is essentially only to the extent absolutely necessary in order to get to that rear yard.
So the
primarily
problem
side
you're trying to
yards.
solve is people have been sort of doing roundabout, I don't want to put words into your mouth, but people have been doing sort of roundabout excavation, and they can do a more direct excavation, even if it disturbs, so that the net effect would be less? Is that
That's
what
right. Yeah, that's the goal.
I have a question. I think this is, at least for me, this is worded confusing, because when I read the second sub-bullet, to me it looks like it's part of piering and fencing, but it's really not.
The headings are flipped for those two, so apologies for that. So the fences and
Okay.
primary setbacks and the grading, those should be flipped from a heading. The heading should be flipped on those bullet points.
Okay, and just this a comment throughout, when we do have the public open house on the 26th, I assume there's going to be more available for the public than what's in this presentation?
So when the public open house happens, and you will have also seen the full draft, we will have copies of the full draft. So if there's a particular point that people want to dig into details, we can flip to the full draft and point to that specific code language so they can see that. It really is trying to strike that balance of giving people an idea of what the changes are conceptually, but then also having the code draft there available to see the specifics.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? The next one's fairly straightforward. Requiring those masonry piers for fences only in the residential estate 1 and residential estate 2 zoning districts. Any other thoughts before we switch to neighborhood scale uses? So this is a summary slide. We'll dig into some of these in a bit more detail. One of the general updates we'll be making is editing the lot area and lot width for single unit attached. So that townhouse typology, particularly in the lot width, narrowing that up to 14 feet is something that we've currently proposed. And part of the idea with this is wanting to make that typology more appealing because it tends to be a homeownership type building. It doesn't always have to be, but it tends to be. So we want to make sure that the district standards associated with that make that a more feasible development option. So that's why that change is being proposed. Another are adding some neighborhood serving uses. So we'll talk a bit more in detail about neighborhood unit. That's the manor house typology that has been referenced previously. Age-restricted units, that's a new use as well. Neighborhood eatery and neighborhood retail, those are small-scale restaurants and retail spaces. Another general edit is that we're moving accessory dwelling guest house, those standards, out of accessory use standards up into primary use standards, and that's just purely a usability modification we're making. So when you see that modification in the draft, we're not striking it, we're just moving it to a more obvious location. It's kind of buried in the back, and we want to move it to the front. And we're also adding some standards for restaurant and multi-unit uses. So we'll get into those. There are slides dedicated to that specifically. Any questions so far on the single unit attached edits or the accessory dwelling? We'll get into everything else later.
On the accessory dwelling, how popular has that been in Sandy Springs? Just curious, because we allow it today. So I know we're just moving it to another section, but how popular has this been?
I'm not sure. I would actually have to defer to either Kristen or Ginger on that.
We do see people using that in our single unit detached districts today. So what you might see is a pool house or a cabana to a pool or something like that. Those areas are often basically an accessory dwelling unit. So they may use it for a grandmother or something like that. But
I'm sorry, were you specific about the lot area and the lot width changes, or did I miss it? Or did you?
I mentioned that the lot width change would be, it varies a bit in certain districts, but it would change to 14 feet wide.
Okay, got it.
And I would have to verify the lot area. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I can get you that information.
All right, thanks.
I'm going to keep moving. Neighborhood unit, so this is what we have been referred to as manor houses. So this is a new use, and we're proposing that it would be allowed in certain districts, particularly in the urban neighborhood districts. And the number of units that would be allowed in these buildings varies. So in the RU district, that would allow up to 4 units in a single building. So this has to be a single building on a lot. That would allow 4 units in that building, so it looks like a house, it feels like a house. In the RT, RM, RX, ON, and OX, that would allow up to 12 units in that one building per lot. And then with that, there are also height limitations. So these have to be 2.5 stories. If they're over 2 stories, they have to have a sloped roof. There are limitations on the width of the building. So this is trying to calibrate the form of these to make sure that they look and feel like houses. And then also any garage or carport would have to be located in the rear yard. So it could be attached, but it has to be in the rear so that they look like these more traditional examples that you see on the slide. Any comments on that? It's not, it would be 4 separate units. So it traditionally is 4 separate renters.
Well, if you have a big house and you subdivide it into 4 units, isn't that like a boarding
They're
house?
actually 4 apartments, probably would be the better terminology.
if you
Okay.
think about a real example here in Sandy Springs at Aria, they have a manor house, which basically has individual condos in the building. So it's sort of like a condo building. But we do have that today at
Okay.
Aria.
Okay.
Kristen,
Thank you.
where, I know we have them in ARIA, and I tried to look on the map. Where is RT, RM, RX, ON, and OX mostly located?
So those are your urban neighborhood kind of areas in the city. So typically those are on the boundary between our more intense districts and our protected neighborhoods. So if you see a townhome development today, that's a perfect example of this kind of district.
And I will add that a lot of these are people are actually seeing being built as condos. So there's a lot of examples in Atlanta. They allowed this typology several years ago, and they've seen a lot of condo developments that have come in this form. Age-restricted units, this is also a new use that we are proposing, and this new use would be allowed in RM, RX, ON, and OX, and these units there's a definition that is set by HUD for age-restricted units, and that specifies that 80% of the units must be occupied by a person 55 years of age or older. That is the HUD definition that we have to strike to meet fair housing requirements. But we're also proposing that these have associated with them the design requirements that we'll be adding for the multi-unit. And also, you will see this come up again in multi-unit, that in the RM district, that 10% of these units must be single unit attached or single unit detached. Any questions about that?
Go ahead.
Great. Restaurant and neighborhood eatery. So you currently allow restaurant. It's a common use, obviously. Neighborhood eatery is essentially a neighborhood scale version of this that we're proposing to be allowed in a few more districts. And with restaurant, we're proposing that gets expanded to a few districts, but with some very specific size and limits on that. So for restaurant, that's your existing use. We're proposing that be allowed in RM. So in RM, it's already allowed in RX, that restaurants are limited to 25% of that development. So that total development sized, only 25% of it could be dedicated to a restaurant, and there are no drive-throughs allowed associated with those restaurants or otherwise. That new use that is the sort of mini restaurant, the cafe or the bistro, that is something that would be qualified as a neighborhood eatery, and so we're proposing that would be allowed in ON, and these have to be smaller than 3,000 square feet. These are fairly small spaces, and then also no drive-through associated with that use.
So that's not allowed in ON?
It's not allowed in ON currently. That's correct. Yeah, so we really tried to craft that neighborhood eatery specifically for ON, making sure that it was smaller and that the no drive-throughs allowed, that they're more neighborhood-oriented spaces.
So will there be criteria for what classifies as a neighborhood eatery as well as a restaurant?
That's right. So in the code, you'll see definitions that will differentiate between the two.
And so just a question on the ON. So on one side of Barfield Road, I believe it's all ON. Does that mean that every building along there could have one of these in it, or we just have a row of them? I guess I'm trying to figure out what that would look like in an ON district. I know the intent would be, have some but not all, but is that conceivable? Because that borders neighborhoods, and that could be disruptive if there were too many.
Possible that, if it's an allowed use, then technically anyone in there could have that use as long as it meets the size criteria and the operation criteria. Sometimes, if it is something that you're concerned about, sometimes uses do have spacing criteria associated with them. So you can only have, if you have one, and it's very similar to your gas stations, for example. So if you have that spacing criteria, then that means once there's one, you can only have the next one so far down the road.
Okay, it's just something I think we should consider because of the blocks of where ON are.
And Councilwoman, the areas along Barfield are OX, are office mixed use. ON is largely south of 285 along Roswell Road.
Very similar conceptually is retail and neighborhood retail. So retail is a use that you currently have. It's just your general retail category, and there aren't really size limitations associated with that. We are proposing that there are some limitations that are added to retail in RX. So that limit would be 6,000 square feet for general retail, but if you're a grocer, up to 15,000 square feet, no drive-throughs allowed, and the creation of a new use category that's that smaller, more neighborhood-oriented neighborhood retail, and that would be allowed in RM, RX, ON, and OX. In RM specifically, that's limited to 25% of that development, so that reflects the language that you saw in the restaurant. They have to be smaller than 3,000 square feet, and also no drive-throughs allowed. Any questions about that? Great. So development patterns are options that you have currently. So cottage court is the most common one that exists for certain districts in your code. So a lot of your urban neighborhoods can develop as a cottage court. We are looking at those existing development patterns to try to encourage the use of that. We really haven't seen many of those develop, and that's for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that the criteria are a bit too stringent. And so we're trying to add some flexibility in there so that we can get some of that development pattern because we feel like it's a desirable typology. And a part of that is making sure that it's allowed for single unit attached, single unit detached, and also those new neighborhood units that we're proposing that they could develop around a cottage court with specific criteria. Any thoughts on that? And then similarly, the shared court is a new development pattern that we would be proposing, and it's very similar to a cottage court, but essentially instead of it facing on a courtyard, it could face on something that is a bit more of a shared street typology or more of a court. So it would be a bit more plaza-like, less, so it could be a little bit, it would feel sort of like the historic Philadelphia townhomes that are on the really narrow streets that are bricked and paved, and so really high design standards with trees in those courts. But it is just a slightly different typology than that cottage court. That cottage court tends to have a bit bigger of a courtyard that tends to be more landscaped. So shared court would be an additional development pattern, but very similar and allowed for those exact same uses. So neighborhood unit attached, detached, and neighborhood units. And it would be on a new street that we'll talk about kind of new streets a bit later. But your team is also developing some new streets to add to your engineering manual. So that would be associated with those new street types that are pedestrian oriented.
So is cottage court currently the only development pattern that's detailed? So it would be these two.
That's right.
The option.
That's correct. And they're just options. It's not a requirement. It allows for a bit of flexibility, and fundamentally it comes down to how land is subdivided. Generally, when land is subdivided, it has to face on a street. And so this allows for lots to front on parks or courts as opposed to a street, and usually they're rear accessed by something like a driveway. So it really is a question of subdivision. I'll keep moving. On to general standards. So let's talk about multifamily. Let's dig into this a bit more. So with proposing the removal of the section 6.6.3, so that is the concrete and steel requirement. Let's talk about some of those requirements that we want to propose as a balance for that being removed. That means that any building would have to follow the International Building Code for construction materials. And for multi-unit, that use that we want to think about specifically, anything over 3 stories in CX, SX, and CS, that would require a conditional use permit that would come before you in those 3 districts. In addition to that, there are some enhanced open space incentives, including how Build 2 is met and building width requirements. So how open space, quality pedestrian open space and the requirements for that open space, how those can be used to meet those requirements. There are also specific requirements that we're proposing for a minimum amount of commercial ready space in CX, SX, TX, CS, IX, CC, and NEX, as well as some specific requirements for 10% of the units in RM to be either single unit attached or single unit detached when associated with multifamily. So it's, you can sort of think of that removal of the concrete and steel in supporting all of these additional benefits that we're asking for associated with the multi-unit.
So we're talking about steel and concrete right now, or wood?
So that's the first point. It would be removing the steel and concrete requirement, but it would be in place of adding all of these additional requirements to the multi-unit typology, to the multi-unit use.
And anything that was built above 3 stories would be a conditional use permit that would have to be approved by council.
That's correct.
So if they go above 3 stories, then it'll come before this body for approval.
and that is in CX, SX, and CS.
One of the, well, you can go. Yeah.
So is that only if they want to use concrete and steel and it's a 6-8 or whatever, then they don't have to come to us, right? If they're allowed to have 6 stories or?
No, so anything above 3 in those 3 districts has to come before you, regardless of construction typology.
Okay. Well, like Embassy Road, we were just talking about that. They have the right for 6 stories, right?
So they're in perimeter, and that would not.
Oh,
qualify.
right. Okay. Got it. Thank you.
So is there no change for RM? No requirements for people, for parcels that are zoned residential multi?
We are not proposing that has to come before you as a conditional use permit. That's something council could certainly change if you wish.
All right. One of the concerns actually, more so than a question, was how this approval impacts the NEX exercise that we did and that creation. The understanding I have is that it actually becomes more a better idea for developers just to not apply for the NEX rezoning. And like if you're shopfront mixed, just to go ahead and, come for the conditional use permit. Like, can we talk about that just a little bit? Is it?
Yeah, and I want to make sure I understand your question. Are you saying the development of properties that are currently NEX or the expansion of NEX into other properties through a rezoning?
Right. So there's a handful of parcels that qualify for that potential zoning, and it was very intentionally created by the council. How does going ahead and relaxing steel and concrete in exchange for these things impact that work, or does it now render it antiquated?
It certainly does not, particularly for the properties that currently have that zoning. So they have their entitlements and are able to develop just as you all particularly negotiated. Another thing that we were very cognizant of was we actually referenced a lot of the requirements that were negotiated in NEX to bake into some of these requirements. So that commercial use requirement, for example, that minimum requirement in those districts, and the single unit minimum in RM, that was referenced from a lot of that effort that was done from the NEX discussions.
NEX is, I thought it was 25. Isn't it 25%?
It is 25.
Okay.
So one of the things we're batting around, to your point of, now NEX is a little less desirable. We do want to consider if there are other changes that we could look at. So one of the things we're considering is a change from 25% single unit to 20. That's still on the table. We're actively talking about that and whether it makes sense, because we do want to figure out if there's a way to make NEX more feasible moving forward. And that's one of the things that we thought might help.
Okay.
On when we do the conditional use permit, that gives us the opportunity to discuss with the developer the mix of housing. In other words, whether they'll have a certain amount of rental property as well as fee simple. We can have input into that process under this formula, correct?
Yes, Mayor. In those three zoning districts,
Right.
Those would come before you all, and you could have those conversations, propose a percentage of single unit if that's appropriate, all of those sorts of things.
And the goal under RM would have 10% of all those units would be single use attached or detached, which lend themselves more to fee simple type housing. Okay.
That's correct.
Thank you.
And can you confirm, I think that heavy timber would be allowed under the IBC, I think Georgia's under the 2018, and they did an update in January 2022, I think. Is that included then now?
It is. So heavy timber would be included in this as an allowed construction type.
Okay, thank you.
That's under the International Building Code, correct?
That's correct.
So all those standards would apply.
That's correct.
Our, I just took a peek at our comprehensive plan, the sort of original one. There's a place in it that calls for, as a suggestion, inclusionary zoning to support sort of workforce type housing, particularly as it relates to high density multifamily. So was that in any way considered when, or particularly as it relates to RM zoned parcels? My concern is that we're sort of incentivizing, perhaps it's a good thing, I don't know, but we're incentivizing the redevelopment of maybe some of the older communities, and then to replace them with brand new stock with no care to that workforce use that it had. I don't know.
That would be one of the issues that could be negotiated under the conditional use permit.
Is that where you see it? Okay, I was thinking.
RM doesn't come in front of us.
Right.
Well, and one of the
right,
things
RM
that
does it.
RM has, it has a bonus height district. So what we do offer in our code is sort of a carrot for bonus height if you provide a percentage of workforce units on the property. So it's a carrot right now. It is not a requirement.
Yeah, I would encourage us to consider a way to make that less of a carrot and more of a real thing that either we get to discuss, which is fine, or it's mandated on some level. Again, I'm just thinking about the situation where you take one of our 50-year-old multifamilies, probably it's a great idea, but you replace it with no care to that function that it had in the community. So that's just my 2 cents. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. It's great feedback. I'm going to keep moving to a related topic. So this is office to residential conversion. And the proposal for this, it would be converting from a commercial use to something that is more like a multi-unit use. And that would be allowed in ON, which doesn't currently allow that, but only if the building has been previously used for a commercial use for a minimum of 5 years, and that would require a conditional use permit, so that would come before you, and you could negotiate terms on that individual proposal. In OX, there's a bit of a tweak to that. So multi-unit would be allowed in a building used for commercial use for 5 years, same requirement, and that multi-unit use would be allowed by right on the 3rd floor and above, but if they were to propose a multi-unit use on the 1st or 2nd floor, that would require a conditional use permit, again, to come before you all. So a bit of a nuance in the OX districts. Any questions about that?
Is this what's necessary? We've had discussions about this office conversion to residential, and we're reading about it in the paper every couple of weeks. Is this really the biggest obstacle that you guys identified as a barrier to this? Because you said, as you and I have discussed, if residential is allowed, building code drives the quality of the residential units that are put in these office buildings, these formerly office buildings. So that we don't need more in our code to define the residential aspect of conversions. We just need to allow it, and that's what we're talking about here. We just didn't allow it before.
That's correct. So it would be allowing it, but with a conditional use permit in ON, and then in OX, a conditional use if they want to do it on the 1st or 2nd floor. So it's allowing a use that isn't currently allowed. Yeah. Yes.
When it says commercial use for 5 years, what does that mean? Does that mean like it had to be an office building? It can't be a hotel or something, right?
So a hotel would be under your lodging. We can narrowly define commercial use if we want. Right now, that's a use category, so anything that falls under that commercial use category could be qualified. We could narrow that to specific things like office, for example.
Like medical
Medical buildings.
Yeah,
things like
I would think we would probably want to do that. Look at that. Thanks.
Yes, that's good feedback. And I'm going to talk a bit about the proposed new height districts. And I'm going to toggle back and forth actually between this slide and the next slide because these really work hand in hand, and these work with the carrot that Kristen mentioned earlier with workforce housing. So we are proposing some new height districts, and these districts would not be mapped anywhere, so somebody would have to ask for a rezoning to go to this new height district. And they are bonus heights with the additional height through this community benefits matrix. So let me talk about the new districts first, and then we can talk about the community benefits matrix. And so anytime you see that slash, you have some of these in your current code. That means that if you don't meet any of the bonus criteria, your height is limited to that first number. So residential multi-unit, for example, RX, that should be RM. That residential mixed use, RX3 is what you have today. The new height district would be 3/6. So that would allow for a bonus up to 6 if you met certain criteria based on that matrix. In your mixed use districts, that's your commercial CX3/6, 6/8. You have a shop front SX 3/6, 6/10, and then City Springs, that would be a 6/8. What does that mean? That means that any district that has a slash in it, that it would be able to look at this community benefits matrix, and this is purely just a snapshot of that matrix. That community benefit list that you see in blue at the bottom, that goes on for several pages, and these are essentially public goods that would be in trade for certain credits. And if you do those public goods, then you get the credits necessary in order to use that bonus height. And so this is something that would obviously need to be reevaluated annually, this community benefit matrix, to make sure that, are you assigning the correct credit to each of these items for things that you want to see. So the ones that are pulled out as examples are things like providing community tables and chairs, masonry on a facade, providing pet waste stations, and associating a certain amount of credit with those. These credits include things like providing upgraded public space that's landscaped, or a plaza that is a high design with a great landscape plan with pavers. It also does include things like providing workforce housing would get you a credit. So we will provide you with that full list of benefits and the credits associated with those for you to review in detail. But I wanted to make sure that we just described conceptually what the goal was, this essentially menu of things that a developer could say, I'm going to do these 10 in order to achieve my credits I need to get my bonus height. Does that make sense, the system that we're trying to create?
So a couple things. There's a lot to this. This is going to take a while for our residents and our builders to unpack this and figure out just what all this means. I would suggest an example or two so that people can actually see the logic behind it. The second question I've got is, or the first question, that was a comment. The question is somebody else doing this right now? Is this modeled after some city somewhere that's doing this and they've had what the results have been? Has this been modeled after someplace else that's already done this and tried this, and how did that work out?
I'm actually going to defer to Kristen on using some of the examples. She worked with staff pretty extensively to come up with this list based on a lot of the things that you all have prioritized. So Kristen, if you could speak to that a bit.
Yeah, Councilman, on the prior slide, actually, that's an image from the Jamestown rezoning. That was part of what we looked at. We looked at this as a real example of how something like this could apply because they were providing so many things that we thought the community wanted to see. And one of the things that happened through that rezoning process was that they were limited to a certain percentage of the site at 6 stories. So in essence, they're sort of a 3/6 district in some ways because they have that limitation on the percentage of the site. So back on the next slide, one of the things that we tried to create from that is what you see on that top table. would limit the percentage of the site that could be the higher number of stories based on how many points you get. So we really used Jamestown as an example to try to create something that we thought would make sense. But as Christy said, one of the things we'll have to do with this is go through an exercise with the developer and look at, how does this actually apply? Are we assigning the right number of points? So this will be sort of a living document that we will bring back and edit over time as well.
Got it. And let me go back and ask my question. Is this being used in another town somewhere, another city somewhere, and how's it working? Or did we just we've kind of built this based on the needs we see in the city? So that's my direct question. Is this being used, this philosophy being used in another community, and how's it working?
I would say yes, many communities use this, but in a more limited capacity. So there are a lot of communities that have sort of a batch of environmental standards, for example. That's very common. And say that, you have to, so the city of Richmond, Virginia actually just implemented this. You have to have 80 points in order to meet your environmental criteria. And then there's an entire menu of options in ways that you can achieve those 80 points.
And then you get more stories or something like that.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. All right, thanks.
So a quick, since we're on this slide, here's an example, because I'm curious about this. Specific example, 31 acres, currently zoned right now RM 3/8. Is it better for that particular parcel now to go, because they can go up to 8 as a bonus. They get a bonus 5, I guess. Or with this, like what would be the differences?
So one of the reasons why we wanted to create this, our existing code has a bonus structure, but it is not that structured, and no one has taken advantage of it. So it doesn't clearly outline, how many of these things do you have to do to get that bonus height, and exactly, what does that look like? So we wanted it to be more clear so that a developer literally has a menu of options and they can say, we're going to do these 3 things, and we were going to do those, 2 anyway. So some of these things are just practical things that make sense. But in essence, this is just trying to clarify what we already have.
Okay. And how many points is sort of workforce housing? What is that worth? I don't know if I see it on the slide. No.
It's not listed on the slide,
Okay.
but we can provide you a full list of all of the credits and what they would be worth in the next day or 2.
Okay, thanks.
One question.
Yeah.
What does the asterisk mean after reduction? I mean, there's no legend. I mean, I don't know if is that anything significant or not.
So that would be limited to your perimeter center districts that have height minimums. And so you could, in trade for a height reduction, do some of these
This is for
credits.
perimeter. Okay.
It's for perimeter specifically.
Okay.
That's
you.
right.
Go ahead.
Speaking of minimum height standards, roll to the next point. We are proposing that the minimum height standards would be eliminated in City Springs, and then in Perimeter Center that those height requirements would be adjusted. So the minimum height requirements would be reduced generally, and there would be a specification that those minimum height requirements would not apply to single unit detached or attached uses, and 50% of that site, if it's larger than 5 acres, could be used for single unit attached or detached, and this is in Perimeter Center specifically. There is also an exemption in the code for what we're calling a jewel box style development, and that is illustrated by some of these smaller buildings in the sort of center of the boulevard that tend to be sort of one-off buildings in the park, pretty high design, but we don't want to preclude that from happening internal to a development by these minimum height standards. So it's giving a bit of flexibility for sort of limited amounts of space like these jewel box buildings. And those would be
Avalon has used a lot of that
Yeah.
in their construction.
Exactly.
And so it adds to the ambiance and the utility of the site. Keeps it from being monolithic.
Yeah, exactly. Any questions about that?
Go ahead.
As I mentioned previously, there are a few street types that are being proposed, and these are primarily pedestrian-oriented streets that are shared. They're sometimes called things like festival streets, so they tend to be pavered, pretty high design standards, things like specified street trees that meet a lot of the standards that you raised earlier of the types of trees that do well in those environments, which are obviously of high concern. So those are some new street types, and we'll have the specifics of those available in the coming days as well. But wanted to give you an update on that. And then a couple quick use modifications. We are rounding the end of this presentation, so we're almost there. Adding life science uses, defining biosafety level 1 and level 2. So these are federally defined uses. These are all administrative approval, so that would have to go to the director for review of specific criteria. And those would be biosafety 1, which is the least hazardous is even the right word. Those are just essentially R&D facilities, very basic labs. And that would be in most of the corridor and node districts, including IX, CC, and Perimeter Center. So they tend to be associated with office space, particularly as more biotech companies are moving into the metro area. Biosafety level 2, that's just an incremental step up, sort of low hazard lab space, and those would be permitted with administrative approval in OX, CX, IX, CC, and Perimeter Center.
So I have a question. How would we enforce these labs? So I know that there's 4, I did some research, and there's 4 different levels, right? These are the first 2. One seems pretty, the other one I'm not so sure about. We'll have to hear from the public on that. But I just want to know, we've been news reports of illegal labs popping up, labs not following protocol. So is this a code enforcement issue? Are we now going to be enforcing code at these facilities, or will some other body or group of bodies do that?
This would be code enforcement, and what we generally find is oftentimes these uses, when they're not allowed, they're happening illegally. And so it's really important to define them and call them out in the code so that you can enforce them. So once you have them defined and allowed with certain criteria, it becomes much easier to enforce.
So who does the inspections, right? Does our staff have the background to be able to go in and say whether, a lab is meeting the specifications to the requirements?
Part of what would happen with that is when the plans would come in for development approval to build that space, they would have to be checked by the staff. And then as far as code enforcement, that's an enforcement mechanism. And Kristen, I don't know if you have anything to add on that. But that would be enforced like any other zoning code enforcement, where it may be that there's sort of an initial code enforcement officer that comes in and writes a report, and there may be someone else that needs to come in and do a follow-up inspection afterwards. These are generally policed by health departments as well.
So I guess the question is then, would we require that they follow certain inspection protocols, not suggesting we go do that, but that they're doing what they need to do from a lab perspective?
That is primarily controlled by the health department. So as a biosafety level 1 lab or a biosafety level 2 lab, it's kind of like a restaurant, in that a restaurant has to meet certain health code criteria. These labs have to do the same thing.
Is it more or less pretty easy to adapt an office space to these kind of uses? Or would this apply to more like new office stock?
I would say it's generally going to be new or in addition to an existing office, because there's pretty significant mechanical requirements for any type of, even like a high school chemistry lab has pretty specific HVAC requirements.
Can't expect this use to help with the issues we're having, or some of the issues we're having with the empty office space. That's not necessarily.
I would say it depends on the stock. There have been some in Midtown Atlanta that have retrofitted for some of the biotech labs, particularly around Georgia Tech. So if it's your big plate office building in a perimeter center, then that's a lot more feasible than sort of a 1980s low-rise office. That would be much harder to retrofit, I would say.
I have one more question. So at the public meeting on the 26th, will there be some sort of a chart that shows people what's allowed in these different classifications of 1, 2, 3, and 4, so people can see what the risks are in different things?
We can certainly provide that.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, these are the two lowest levels. You're not really dealing with viruses and volatile chemicals. You're really doing basic research on DNA and low-level, So we're not talking about real biohazard type stuff or chemical hazard type stuff. That would be much more rigorous at levels 3 and 4.
That's correct.
Do we have any of these already in Sandy Springs?
We've had some, yeah.
So we've already had a BSL 1
Yeah, we
or
had,
BSL 2?
what was the name of the company down on Roswell Road that they had lab facilities there. They were doing research. So we have had them here before.
Yeah, I thought there
They're
was
not
one.
they're not in business here now that I know of, but we
There's
have
one
had
on
them in the
Dunwoody
past.
Place.
What's that?
There's one on Dunwoody Place. That's more of our industrial.
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking about. But what we're doing is we're allowing this, but then we're relying on Fulton County to make sure that they're in compliance. Okay.
Okay,
Okay.
proceed.
I have a couple slides on fuel stations. I'm going to go through both of them, and then I'll take any questions you have. The first is making sure that we have enhanced design standards. So that is setting specific criteria for the canopy design, screening, the build-to requirement. So this illustration shows the store portion of the gas station occupying the corner, as well as requiring pedestrian connections. So that's one piece of it, is making sure that there are enhanced design standards for any fuel station. Another piece is allowing for the expansion of any fuel pumps. So an existing station would be able to add up to 4 pumps, which would be 8 fueling spaces. So there, a fueling space on either side of the pump. In trade for the building and canopy facade being renovated to the new design standards, vehicle and pedestrian access being improved, screening is provided in compliance with the code, and also any signs are brought into compliance. So this really is targeting, trying to make sure that your existing stations are coming into compliance with the standards of your code. And then the couple other items on this, the 1-for-1 replacement.
I'm sorry, can we go
Sure.
back?
Yeah.
So these new enhanced design standards, do they apply to the existing gas stations?
They would if they were proposing to add pumps.
Okay, only, so these two go together in tandem.
That's
And that
correct.
should say add up to 4 pumps, right? So it says add, I think the word up to is missing. Oh. And then what are the penalties if these new, like if they go in and they say they're going to do all of these new things and then they don't do it? Like, will they have penalties, or, will their business license be revoked, or we don't know that yet?
That would, in theory, be a building permit question. So like any construction project, you have to meet all the compliance portions of the code before you to receive a certificate of occupancy. So for them to receive that certificate in order to do business, they would have to meet all these standards.
Okay, thank you.
Another proposal is a 1-for-1 replacement. And so this would be a removal of the distance requirement, and the gas station could relocate to an existing site only when a conditional use permit is granted and all the design standards are met, including those enhanced design standards. So that would be required to come before you as a conditional use permit for that to happen. And another is fuel pumps as accessory uses. So that's the image, sort of Costco being the poster child for this. Any existing retail use that's over 35,000 square feet could have up to 8 pumps, 16 fueling spaces. No convenience sales or vending machines would be allowed with that accessory use.
Are existing facilities like Kroger, are they grandfathered? I mean, they've got vending machines and other things there. So they would be grandfathered, or would they have to remove those? They would have to remove them if they did enhancements or added pumps. But if you're existing now and you don't make any changes, then you don't come under these requirements, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's a good question about, there's a certain level of convenience. One of the things that may have prompted this, we're looking at some Costco's don't have as many pumps as others. For example, I know the one I go to frequently is Brookhaven. I'm just trying to picture it in my mind. I feel like it's more than 8. Where did the number 8 from? I feel like there were 3 rows. What?
The one here has 8.
The one here is, so, but, yeah, but you're allowing only up to 8 pumps as opposed to 9 pumps. I'm just wondering what the magic to 8 was, because I'm thinking, I mean, there's a real environmental benefit and convenience benefit. I mean, the lines stack up, and when you allow the extra pumps, so why just 8? Has some thought gone into whether it should be 8 or 9, or what's the magic to that number?
It was honestly looking at a lot of your existing accessory fuel pumps, and that was around where a lot of folks were.
It's also CUP, but
it's a bit of a comfort question, right? Like, do you want to allow more or less?
Well, I want to be thoughtful in why we're doing it. So just kind of make a note that take a look at. I'm trying to picture. I feel like the one I go to in Brookhaven is a 9 pump. I think it's 1, 2, 3, then 6, 9, and boy, it moves a lot faster than the one at Peachtree Dunwoody. Because it's just 1, and I think there it's just maybe just 2. I'm trying to remember. Is it 3? No, it's not 4 and a lot. Not a 9. Anyway, let's just make sure we're thoughtful on that number.
Okay, we'll do a bit more research of accessory pumps outside of Sandy Springs in the surrounding areas.
So I have a question on the conditional use permit. So does this only apply to zoning districts that today allow a conditional use for fuel, or does this now open it up for City Springs?
It would not open it up. It would keep it in the existing districts that allow fuel stations.
Okay. And then can you talk a little bit about why, what's the benefit of removing the distance requirement? The benefit and detriment, please.
The detriment is that you no longer have a specified distance that would require the distance between them. It would all have to come before you for negotiation, so it's not a hard and fast rule. So you do have to spend time negotiating that. That's certainly the downside. The benefit is this would, in theory, hopefully spur some redevelopment of your existing stations. Whereas now they're sort of locked in because of that distance requirement. So that flexibility for negotiation would mean that it's much more feasible for some of those to go away and new, more modern stations to come online.
Okay, thank you.
Mayor?
Mr. Baumann.
So let's, good question about City Springs. We currently have gas stations in City Springs, isn't that right? So the 1-for-1 replacement, well, 1-for-1 replacement is everywhere. It's just we couldn't do it. We couldn't remove the distance requirement in City Springs. What were you saying there? I'm a little confused. So the distance requirement would still apply in City Springs?
There would be no distance requirement, but fueling stations, and I may have to have staff double check.
I'm trying to understand. I think we all know there's some specific projects that have been floated. I'm not going to be very,
Right.
I'm trying to understand what the impact is or isn't here.
So if I remember correctly, City Springs does not allow fueling stations as a primary use. And so any new fueling station couldn't go in there. You could only issue a conditional use permit in a district that allows fueling stations.
So nothing we would do under the development code could change that. That would be under a different part of the code.
You would have to allow fueling stations in City Springs in order to do that. And you could allow them with a conditional use permit,
Right.
but you would have to add that allowance to that district.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on this? I think we have some good.
What about EV?
research. Oh, EV. We have a whole slide on it. So yeah, I thought it was the next one. You almost set me up perfectly. We will talk about vehicle showrooms quickly before jumping into EV. So vehicle showrooms, this is a new use, and this really is, Tesla's the poster child for it. It is more of a retail use, but they happen to sell cars. It's almost like if you took an Apple store and put cars in it, which is kind of what Teslas are. So we are proposing that would be allowed in OX, the corridor and node districts, and perimeter center, and they must display the vehicles indoors, so no outdoor storage of vehicles would be allowed. This example is like embedded at a mall, for example. No vehicle repair or maintenance use would be allowed. It purely is like a retail space, and they are limited to 5,000 square feet, so quite small. Any questions? And you'll, of course, see the full use table, and you can see the specific district allowances for that new use on that use table. EV. And we looked this in here with a couple other accessories. So we are defining EV chargers as an accessory use because generally, they're not really primary. They exist with a lot of other uses. And so with that, we are defining level 1, 2, and 3 charging and associating specific standards with each of those levels. So level 1 being sort of your residential charger, level 2 being a bit faster, something that you find more commercially. I think you actually have a couple level 2s in the City Springs deck. And then level 3 are the sort of superchargers. And so those would have the most design criteria associated with them because they have more infrastructure associated. And so this includes things like screening requirements, where they can be located, making sure that if it's on a site adjacent to a protected neighborhood, that they can't be located next to that protected neighborhood, particularly if they're a level 2 or level 3 charging station. Screening requirements, making sure they're not directly adjacent to the sidewalk. And then also some requirements for the signage and the screens associated with these to make sure they don't become billboards that also happen to charge cars. So having some specific criteria around that.
Does anyone else? Does the technology exist? And I'm sure it does, I just don't know a lot about it. Does the technology exist that would allow us to get a sense of how much in demand our local EV chargers are? I mean, our local, the ones that are for public use?
That's a good question. Is there any reporting on that?
I don't know about the ones on this campus. I would assume so. We'll check into that. But I will say we've had a number of interested parties reach out to us about wanting to add additional EV charging capacity in the city. Sandy Springs seems to be a hotspot for EVs in the region, so they are very interested in figuring out ways to add more EV chargers here.
And this is a major concern for, like, Mercedes, because they're moving rapidly into production of electric vehicles. And the concern is the infrastructure, particularly for people who are going longer distances, and making sure that there's an infrastructure that people are, when they're traveling over, say, the 400-mile limit of their battery. Some of them are getting bigger, I know, but I'm just going to use that as the cutoff point right now. There was a trip that went from here to Washington, D.C. They were great for the first 450 miles, and then they had to charge overnight to get the rest of the way. So that's one of the concerns about electric vehicles, particularly for long-distance travel, is the absence of the supercharging networks where you can get them charged in about 20 minutes across the whole country. So ultimately, there are going to be national standards for this. But in the meantime, we need to make sure we're doing what we can, because the number of Teslas driving our streets right now are rather significant, and other EVs are coming on, so we've got to begin to think about how we accommodate them. So I'm glad we're taking this first step. We may have to adapt and adjust as new technologies come on, but this is a good first start.
Mayor Paul, if I may.
Mr. Paulson.
So why are we dictating level 1, 2, and 3 charging in this? Why don't we just designate this area, you're allowed EV charging? And because these are all going to change. A year from now, level 1, 2, and 3 may be much different. So now we've written a code that's obsolete before we even have a chance to turn around. But why are we going to this level of specificity? Or why can't we just put this is a designated EV charging station, and whatever the marketplace wants to put in that location, that's their business, not ours? I'm trying to understand why we're going to this level of detail here.
Yeah, it's a great question. And fundamentally, we're really just defining level 1, 2, and 3. The only difference in the requirements, we do have some more screening requirements associated with level 3 because they tend to be larger equipment facilities. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case. We certainly could write the code to be much more flexible.
what we have to anticipate is that particularly in redevelopment or existing retail districts, because what happens is when you're charging, you're there and you're going to be shopping at the store. So the retailers want them there. And you're going to be there at least with the level 3, you're going to be there at least 20 to 30 minutes. So you're out buying stuff while your car's charging. So we're going to probably over the next couple of years see a real increase in the number of commercial, particularly retail districts, restaurants, others that are going to want to install chargers. And you don't want them on the street, so we have to have some level of specificity to make sure.
I got it. I agree with all that. I'm just, how much specificity do we need? Because this is a dynamic, evolving industry. Allowing EV chargers with whatever minimum guidelines, I guess, is my recommendation.
And I don't disagree with you, John, but at the same time, if we don't get specific, as soon as we leave an unintentional loophole, somebody's coming for it. So
Okay, well, that's
one of the reasons why, with this level of specificity, the great thing about this is this body meets every 2 weeks. So we have the opportunity to make adjustments as technology evolves, and we will be making a lot of adjustments in this area. I don't think there's any question. Mr. DiGiulio.
We're putting a lot of requirements on petroleum stations. Just across the street, we have EVs in the middle of the parking lot, and we've got no requirements on those. Is your proposal on here that we go ahead and put requirements on these EV stations, which are, I guess they're an accessory use across the street? They just popped up overnight. And I assume we had nothing to do with that. Did they get any type of permits from us to put those EV charging stations across the street?
I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but I'll find out.
I hope so.
Sandy Springs Plaza's got EV charging stations in it, in the parking lot.
Here comes the answer, lady.
Yes, they were approved, and our struggle with what popped up across the street is that we really didn't have any regulations to regulate it. It has a screen on it that we really aren't that keen on, and so that's why we want to have some design standards in places where they should go.
So they were approved by who?
Us, my team.
By your office?
Yes,
But you had no authority to do anything other than approve them. Is that correct?
right.
Did you have any authority to approve them?
Yes. Yes.
I thought you were only allowed like 1 or 2 accessory unit or things. And
Right. I believe we classified it as a, what is the name? What is the word? Unmanned retail station. Yes, that's how we classify those things. And we wanted to create a section in our ordinance that actually addressed them specifically, because we didn't know how to classify it, but we knew we needed it. So that's how
Hey, if you go down to Buckhead, there's a
people
pizza
needed to charge
there's
their
a
cars.
pizza vending machine now on the sidewalk down in Buckhead. So those things will just pop up.
Okay.
All right.
I think we understand that we need to give staff some direction in managing this process, and this is our first effort at it. We will refine it as we go through time, because this is an area of rapid change, and we'll have to make adjustments, I'm sure, quite frequently for government anyway over the next few years.
One more question about EVs. Would it be fair to assume that on our list of enhanced community benefits that we talked about a few slides ago, that EV chargers is one of those things to get a couple points?
I'll verify if it's in there. I think it's certainly a phenomenal idea.
Yeah, and they're doing it.
Yeah.
Well, they're going to do it anyway if they want to bring people in. Their tenants are going to require it. So we need to be able to adapt to it. It may be something that, if we find out that they're not, and when they should, then that's something that not only should we be giving credit for, but may be something that we will be requiring them to do in order to accommodate their own tenants, whether they're retail tenants or they're residential tenants. We have chargers here. The apartments have chargers. And so, you just got to adapt to the reality that this is the way of the future, and everybody's going to have to figure out how they incorporate chargers into residential and retail districts.
All
All right, daycare.
I'm going to wrap us up with daycare, and then we'll go on to the schedule, and presentation will be over. Daycare, making sure that's a permitted accessory use in places of worship, and there are some criteria associated with that. So it would have to be operated as the same operator as the place of worship. So these couldn't be third party.
Is that a problem with any of the daycares in churches now? Because I thought there were one of these churches, they have a separate entity that comes in and manages their daycare. Do I remember that correctly?
The answer lady returns.
Here we go. The answer lady.
All right, ask me your question again.
So, does this this last bullet point put a restriction on churches that would cause them to be in non-compliance because of how they're operating today? I thought one of these outfits had a separate third-party organization managing the daycare center at their facility.
Okay, so there are a couple of things that happen currently. One is that they're grandfathered in, and they don't even have a cup for the original church to be there. So it's kind of a grandfather thing that we inherited from Fulton County. So we have those circumstances. Then we have circumstances where they do have a special use or conditional use permit to have the church be there as well as a daycare allowed to be there. What we're looking to do is to allow it as a regular use, not to have to come to you for a cup, in order for an existing church to have a daycare that's sponsored by themselves. That's what we're looking to do.
I mean, it's one thing. It's one thing to have a daycare that accommodates your population, particularly your workers. But if an organization is doing a business, adding a business that they're going to operate of a daycare center, all the requirements not having to be met anyway. I mean, I could foresee a situation where all of a sudden they're doing 200 children. Where we would have a very definite community interest in ingress and egress and parking and safety and
right.
All those things.
So it'll probably be governed a lot by that. So it's governed by how large is the space that can accommodate, where is their queuing. So there are certain things that we look at. Where is their play space going to be? Can you queue enough cars for the population that you want to accommodate?
Okay, but it's going to be permitted, but subject to...
Yeah, oh, sure.
Oh.
We have to go through this whole process when they go through the
I just want
permitting
to make
process.
sure. Yeah, okay.
You don't turn it into child care
Yeah, I
Wild
just want
West.
to avoid them.
Right.
Yeah.
No,
So-
but let me
We
tell
look
you
at
why
all
this.
those things
Yeah,
when we go
why
through the permitting.
societally this is important. We have 3 million people. This is in Georgia. 3 million people out of the workforce today, and a huge labor shortage. That 3 million is mostly women who've left the job market because of the cost and the absence of child care. And so everybody, the labor shortage that not only the city of Sandy Springs faces, but every employer that we have here is in large part related to the absence of child care. So anything that we can do to encourage houses of worship, churches, synagogues, mosques, whatever, to provide those services, and most of them will be to their congregants. That's the case. I mean, you may have some outside, but this is a real problem that's got to be addressed, and getting families to be able to have the availability of these services is crucial for the families as well as for society at large. So this is something I think we want to make sure that they're the right safety standards that they have to maintain, even if they have to be inspected or whatever that we require. But the ability to create more opportunities for child care in this community is very important. Ms. Rochelle.
What about daycare in offices like Mercedes-Benz has their own? Is that a different?
They're allowed.
They're allowed. Okay.
Under the use table, yes.
Anything else? All right, thank you very much. That is an extended work session.
I have
Ms.
two
Mueller.
things overall.
Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry.
So,
No, I'm.
Yeah,
I thought we were.
wrapping up.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
I'm
I do.
sorry.
have a
I have to
comment.
remind you.
Ms.
when you have to
Mueller
do
has
this
a
again.
question.
yeah, could we go through the schedule first, and then it's related to that?
Okay.
My clicker is not working. If someone could just progress the next slide. Yes, thank you. So, Planning Commission work session, that's going to happen tomorrow. I'll be presenting virtually to them. Friday, the draft code will be posted online, so that full text, you can dig into each one of these details. So we are working furiously toward that. On Tuesday, September 26th, there will be a public open house where all of this information will be presented. Folks can come in, have a talk with the staff, and we'll be there as well as the consultants. We are currently scheduled for November 13th to have the public hearing with Planning Commission, and then that public hearing proceeding before you all on December 5th.
Okay, yeah. So a couple things for the 26th. I think it would be helpful if we had a glossary of terms, because there's certain terms that are here and probably in the detail that people won't know what they mean. So I think that'll be important. And then I know this was a very brief presentation, but I think it's going to be important for people to understand why we're doing things, why we're doing them, what are we doing, and then what are the benefits, the perceived benefits. I think that, so it's the why, the what, and then the associated benefits. So I think that'll be important for the 26th and whatever materials are presented. And then this question has to do with the December 5th and what comes before this body for a vote. I would like to ask, and I think that I would like to hear from my other council people, is that we package these up such that they can be grouped together and voted on as, I don't know what the categories, I'm not the expert here, but so we don't get in a situation where we're looking at a federal government omnibus bill that we're going to be passing and it's a yes or a no for everything.
So, Councilwoman, to that question specifically, we have talked through this because there are other technical amendments. These are just some big policy items we wanted to make everybody aware of. There are a lot of changes in the code. The way that we are planning to structure this is that we will bring forward packages of articles. So the code is organized by article. So I think we've looked at about 5 different packages that will come before you all as separate items to consider that evening.
Okay. Thank you. That makes me feel better. Thank you.
Bring a sleeping bag on December 5th.
So there'll be separate public hearings? Is that what we're saying? Or just one?
Yes.
Separate items. Okay.
Thank you all.
All right, thank you. That is the end of the work session at 8:06 p.m. All right, moving to regular order. I would like to call this meeting of the Sandy Springs City Council to order for Tuesday, September 19th. Will the city clerk please make the announcements and call the roll?
Good evening, Mayor and Council. First, I'd like to remind those in attendance to silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. Individuals who would like to provide public comment at a council meeting are required to complete and submit a public comment card in advance of the meeting. Public comment cards are available online and at the chamber entrance. Those providing public comment may be allotted up to 3 minutes to speak on their single chosen topic. As I call roll, please confirm your attendance. Mayor Rusty Paul.
Present.
Councilmember John Paulson. Here. Councilmember Melody Kelly.
Here.
Councilmember Melissa Mueller.
Here.
Councilmember Jody Rochelle. Councilmember Tibby DiGiulio. Councilmember Andy Bauman.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam Clerk, any public comment cards?
Yes, we've received 5 public comment cards this evening. Everybody is in-house tonight.
All right.
I'll call folks down 1 or 2 at a time to queue up the next speaker. The first we have Jim Newberry, who will be followed by Janet Wells.
Mr. Newberry. He's gone.
Okay.
Ms. Wells.
After Janet Wells, we have Karen Misen McInerney.
Hi. Greetings, Mayor, council members. Thank you for your time. I am a board member of Environment Sandy Springs. And Jim Newberry is our president, and he had to leave early. So he just wanted to say that he really supports Willie Park's proposal of the potential uses of the tree fund. And I concur completely. And so I'm adding to that, especially the landmark tree protection grant. When I first built a home here in '94, we had to circle any tree on our plan that was a specimen tree, we called it. What do you call it? Keystone now or something like
Landmark.
that? Landmark tree. And yes, and so I'd like to see that come back, if that's a possibility, to save it. And maybe our construction people had to pay the tree fund to cut down those trees on the property when we developed it. So maybe we can reverse that and pay them not to cut them down. So just a thought. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Wells. Ms. Mines and McInerney,
Who's
welcome back.
Who's followed by Rhonda Smith.
Good evening. Thank you all for being here, doing what you're doing. I always say that. Karen Mines and McInerney, 4604 Meadow Valley Drive, District 6. Love the tree fund policy, the presentation, Willie Parks and sustainability. Catherine, they've done a fabulous job. And I also support Andy's comments about in the future looking at general fund money to be advanced for salaries and such, although I totally support the use of the fund currently for his salary. He's just added so much to the preservation of our tree canopy in Sandy Springs. I'd now like to talk about the development code, and I specifically focus on protected neighborhoods and the very unique designation south of Glen Ridge of a corridor node called ON. It's Office Neighborhood. And it's the only location in the city where this designation is allowed. And it was really protected and has been protected by every single council since the founding, when we were able to recognize that that area had three significant retail nodes that existed, commercial nodes, the Gateway, Fountain Oaks, and up around Glen Ridge where the Valero is. So what we did back then, and have done every single time that development code has been modified, is we have all the retail and commercial and multifamily apartments are all, inside the nodes. So what's between the nodes are low-rise condominiums. We have low-rise office. Nothing can go over an acre, 3 stories. We have museums. We just added churches. It's a really low-density feel for that area with those commercial nodes, those viable retail nodes. So we don't need any more uses, retail, called neighborhood eatery and neighborhood retail, to be added in between those spaces. We need them. They can go. There are plenty of places for them to go in the retail nodes that exist today. So please continue to preserve the ON designation and the uses that are in it. And speaking on that, I'm interested in the manor house condo building concept. That sounds like it would be a good use in ONN or ON that allows up to 12 units. The look of it, I think that would fit very well.
Ms. McInerney, you got to wrap it up.
Outside the nodes, okay. Age restricted looks like that would be a new use. I don't know about the conversion, and I don't want shared court, but I think that let's let cottage court work first. One more. I don't think there's any support in the community to remove the 1/2 mile gas station inclusion. And
Ms. Mines and McInerney, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Ms. Smith.
Who will be followed by Bill Cleveland.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Rhonda Smith, 76 Long Island Place. Speaking to you as president of the Sandy Springs Council of Neighborhoods on behalf of our board tonight. The agenda memo introducing the Development Code work session item detailed that it was in part, quote, proposing edits to the topics deemed by council to be of particular priority to the city's vitality, end quote. Vitality, the state of being strong and active. Many changes we heard do promote vitality and help overcome economic pressures that challenge positive growth and development we want to see as our city is moving into its future. Please consider all of the possible consequences of some of the proposed code changes presented tonight. Will they provide more vitality or create additional challenges to maintaining the highest quality of life for your constituents? Will proposed changes create new pathways to undesirable outcomes and have unintended consequences? With the adoption of the 2017 Development Code regulations, what Council approved told the public it wanted to limit and dissuade more auto-centric uses from Roswell Road and particularly from our city center. Elimination of the half-mile rule for gas stations as proposed could create a domino effect in places you might not anticipate. A larger scale station certainly could land at the gateway to City Springs where we wish to promote walkability, not more cars, and where fuel today is legal non-conforming, and at the city's northern and southern gateways as well. Eliminating the rule, while it is a CUP, will be a new pathway for these changes, a new opportunity for the rezoning ask for larger scale stations that does not exist today. For example, from City Springs to commercial mixed use, where fuel is allowed today. Is this the right use for our pivotal gateway locations regardless of enhanced design standards? Please carefully look at the parcel makeup of the properties at the city gateways. Today, they are larger parcels with large parking lots and small buildings. Imagine what a large-scale gas station would mean at each of them. Will these create vitality? I would argue that they will not. They will cement forever the auto-centric nature of Roswell Road and move the needle in the opposite direction of where we all wish to be going. Additionally, as you consider change that allows for greater disturbance in the setbacks in protected neighborhood, and particularly in the rear setbacks, please consider that this will result in greater mature canopy tree loss. We are indeed experiencing loss today with infill development, which continues in neighborhoods at great pace despite higher interest rates. Please don't exacerbate the loss that small caliper replacement trees do not mitigate. I look forward to the September 26th Public Information Open House as the next engagement and educational step for the public. Council of Neighborhoods also looks forward to engaging with all of you and Planning Commission members on these proposed changes. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Ms. Smith. Mr. Cleveland.
I am here. My name is Bill Cleveland. I live at 6441 Wright Road in beautiful downtown Sandy Springs. And I'm here to express my support for the tree canopy survey. Now, you've been lectured, I guess, tonight on the wonderful use of AI. You should be proud of your GIS group. The accuracy of this technology is phenomenal. It's over 95%. So I'm going to set that aside and assume that you all have digested all the ramifications, because I haven't. But I will also take this opportunity to elaborate on the idea of making the tree canopy data available to the public. And you've done a wonderful job. It is at the council district level. And I hope you continue this form of reporting of the data in the future. But I would like to suggest that perhaps the tree canopy data could be restricted to only those properties that have to conform to the development code or the tree ordinance codes. That would eliminate all of the parklands, the corridor and other classifications. If you had done this at the beginning of this analysis, you would probably see the 55% that's reported shrink to about 50%. Because I called the National Park Service and asked how much Island Ford and East Palisade had. Together, they're over 700 acres. That's about 5% of the that's an inflation of about 5%. So I hope you continue along these lines, and I think that and I urge each council member to take to invest some time in engaging with your constituents. You have no excuse. You have the data.
Mr. Cleveland, you need to wrap it up.
Okay. You have no excuse. You have the data, and I thank you.
Thank you. Any others? All right, we'll close the public hearing. Is there a motion to approve the meeting agenda?
Mr. Mayor,
Mr. DiGiulio.
I move approval of the meeting agenda for Tuesday, September 19th, 2023.
Mr. DiGiulio moves approval of the meeting agenda. Is there a second? Moved by Mr. DiGiulio, seconded by Mr. Paulson, that we approve the meeting agenda. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. The question is on approval of the meeting agenda. All in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The meeting agenda is approved. Is there a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Mayor Paul.
Ms. Rochelle.
I move that we approve the consent agenda for September 19th, 2023.
Ms. Rochelle moves adoption of the consent agenda. Is there a second?
Second.
Been moved by Ms. Rochelle, seconded by Ms. Mueller, that we approve the consent agenda. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. The question's on the consent agenda. All in favor of the motion say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The consent agenda is approved. Moving to the public hearings, will the clerk please read the first item?
Agenda item number 2023-270. This is ABL 35702. Consideration of an alcoholic beverage license application for Shanny Maddox, LLC, doing business as Beer and Wine Craft Sandy Springs Boutique Winery, and that's at 203 Hildebrand Drive, Sandy Springs, Georgia, 30328. The applicant is Shanny Maddox for manufacturer wine. This is presented by Chief Financial Officer Tony Carlisle.
Ms. Carlisle.
Good evening, Mayor Paul and City Council. This is a change of ownership from manufacturer wine, Shanny Maddox LLC, DBA Beer and Wine Craft, Sandy Springs Boutique Winery, 203 Hildebrand Drive, Sandy Springs, Georgia, 30328. The applicant, Shanny Maddox, has met all requirements and staff recommends approval. This is in Councilwoman Melissa Mueller's district.
Madam Clerk, have we received any public comment cards? All right, we'll close the public hearing. You've heard the report of the Chief Financial Officer. What's the desire of council?
Mayor Paul.
Ms. Mueller.
I move that we approve agenda item 2023-270 ABL 35702 for approval of an alcoholic beverage license application for Shanny Maddox LLC, doing business as Beer and Wine Craft Sandy Springs Boutique Winery, 203 Hildebrand Drive, Sandy Springs, Georgia.
Motion by Ms. Mueller. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Motion by Ms. Mueller, seconded by Dr. Kelly, that we approve agenda item 2023-0000 for the approval of an alcoholic beverage license application for Shanny Maddox, doing business as Beer and Wine Craft. Any discussion? Mr. DiGiulio.
I do have a question about this one, because in one place it says beer and wine, and in another place it says manufacturing of wine. Which is it? Is it a manufacturing beer and wine, or are they just manufacturing wine?
They've listed it as a wine manufacturer, wholesaler type business.
A wine manufacturer, wholesaler?
I think you go there to brew your own wine.
Well, no, I understand, but people brew their own beer too, and
Right.
I'm just wondering if they're doing both of it at this facility or just the one. You don't brew any beer, just in your name?
I sell ingredients to make your own, but I don't brew any there.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Any other discussion, questions? Hearing none, we'll call the question. The question's on agenda item 2023-000, the approval of an alcoholic beverage license application for Shanny Maddox for Beer and Wine Craft Sandy Springs, Georgia. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The item is approved. The clerk will please read the next item.
Agenda item number 2023-271. This is consideration of a resolution to authorize the submission of the City of Sandy Springs 2022 Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report for the Community Development Block Grant Program to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. This is presented by Planning and Zoning Manager Michelle McIntosh Ross.
Before you start, Madam Clerk, I've got all zeros on mine, so I don't know what the item number is.
I'm sorry.
So, well, I'll have one of these just in my script. So we have the
want
first
to switch?
time you've ever done that to me in 10 years.
I'm sorry. Do you want to switch scripts? Mine actually has the.
No,
would it be helpful to you?
I'll fake it till we make it.
Okay.
All right. Proceed, Ms. McIntosh.
Okay,
Ross.
greetings. Thank you, Raquel. This is the Consolidated Performance and Evaluation Report, also known as the CAPER. It is a compilation of the project activities and accomplishments associated with the city's CDBG program. This is a required report for the city's continued participation in the program. Staff has prepared a draft of the 2022 CAPER according to the requirements for submittal to the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Now, as you know, the funds received from the CDBG program have been designated to design and construct public facilities, that is, sidewalks along Roswell Road, to benefit the low and moderate income persons in the community, which meets the national objective of HUD. And in summary, the projects of the progress of the projects during the reporting time, which is July 1, 2022 to June 30th of 2022, has been in accordance with the goals of the annual action plan. We are continuing with phase 3 of the South Roswell Road multi-year sidewalk project. We're doing design, installation of pedestrian lighting on North Ridge between Roswell Road and Georgia 400, and design and environmental work for the streetscape improvement along Roswell Road south of I-285 from Northwood to Long Island Drive. The draft has been posted to the city's website for public review since August 15th, and no comment has been received. With that, staff recommends that the Mayor and City Council approve this resolution to authorize the submission of the 2022 CAPER to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development.
All right, you've heard the report of the Planning and Zoning Manager, or do we have any public comment cards? All right, we'll close the public hearing. You've heard the report of the Planning and Zoning Manager. What's the desire of council?
Mayor Paul?
Mr. Baumann.
I move adoption of agenda item 2023, this is 271, I believe, right?
Correct.
Request for, to authorize Sandy Springs 2022 Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report for the CDBG program to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Motion by Mr. Baumann. Is there a second? Been moved by Mr. Baumann, seconded by Ms. Rochelle, that we approve agenda item 2023-271, authorizing the submission of the City of Sandy Springs 2022 Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report for the CDBG program to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. Is there any discussion?
I have a question.
Dr. Kelly.
How are we standing this year in terms of funding? Do we know? Is it too early in the?
Yeah, it's too early. The last
they haven't passed any appropriations bills yet, so we don't know what the money's going to be.
All right, so that's when then?
Whenever they pass the budget.
I mean, okay, so like last year, when was it?
Yeah.
How about
I think it was May of last year we got that funding. Right on. Yeah, it was May.
Oh, okay.
But in previous years it was August. It is just whenever.
Oh, it changes. Yeah, to the point that was made. Okay, thank
A
you.
lot depends on whatever they do to keep the government from shutting down. If they do a continuing resolution that authorizes this specifically, then they'll be faster. That's not normally what they do. They'll have to pass the HUD appropriations bill before we know exactly how much money has been appropriated for CDBG. Any other discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. The question's on agenda item 2023-271. A resolution authorizing submission of the City of Sandy Springs 2022 Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report for the Community Development Block Grant Program. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no.
Thank you.
The item is approved. The clerk will please read the next item.
Agenda item number 2023-272. This is consideration of approval of a memorandum of understanding between the National Insurance Crime Bureau and the City of Sandy Springs to provide the Sandy Springs Police Department with the necessary access to the ISO claims search database and to authorize the city manager to execute the same. This is presented by Sandy Springs Police Department Major Dan Nabel.
Mr. Major Nabel.
Good evening, Mayor and Council. Thank you for your time. This is just a brief discussion about ISO Claim Search is a database that's managed by NICB, the National Insurance Crime Bureau. And it's a database that has lots of uses for fraud and other law enforcement information. It's administered by a company called Verisk, V-E-R-I-S-K, and we've had access to this database since 2019. It's been very useful in helping us, primarily our detectives and hit-and-run investigators solving various crimes. They have since updated their access requirements, requiring MOUs now, and so we just come to you asking for permission to enter into this MOU, and there is the big footnote is there is no financial impact to the city. It's a free service. It just requires the MOU approved by council.
All right, you've heard the report of Major Nabel. What's the desire of council? Mr. Paulson.
Hang on a second. I move approval of agenda item 2023-272, approval of the MOU between NICB and the City of Sandy Springs to provide the Sandy Springs Police Department with the necessary access to the ISO claim search database and to authorize city manager to execute same.
Motion by Mr. Paulson. Is there a second? Been moved by Mr. Paulson, seconded by Mr. DiGiulio, that we approve agenda item 2023-272, the memorandum of understanding between the NICB and Sandy Springs, providing the police department with the necessary access to the ISO claim database. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. The question's on agenda item 2023-272, approving the memorandum of understanding. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The item is approved. The clerk will please read the next item.
Agenda item number 2023-273. This is consideration to approve the appropriation of certain property rights and interests located at 6300 Glen Oaks Lane, Sandy Springs, Georgia. That's parcel ID number 17-0071-0007-0506. This is through the use of eminent domain as it relates to the Mount Vernon Highway Corridor Improvement Project, and that's project number TS-192. Presented by City Attorney Dan Lee.
Mr. Lee.
Mayor and Council, this is a request for the use of eminent domain for a piece of property at the intersection of Glen Ridge and Mount Vernon. And anybody that travels the road would recognize it. It's right at the red light and runs from the corner west on Mount Vernon. The staff has done a great job of trying to alter the project. They've done it twice to lessen the impact on the property owner there on the corner. And have been unsuccessful for a couple of reasons. One of which is this subdivision was done a little differently. Ordinarily, when there is property that is held in the interest of all the homeowners, it's common area and is held by the HOA. This HOA was created differently in that there is a covenant that requires property owners to allow the HOA to create a buffer when they determine that a buffer is needed between the property owners and the street. Over time, the HOA has placed landscaping in the right-of-way of the city. And here we come with our road project, and the property owner, who is in negotiation with the HOA about what goes back into the new area, is presented to the city that they want to be paid for the landscaping that is now in the right-of-way, which the city has no duty to pay for. Secondly, they want to be paid for landscaping that they want to go back in the new right-of-way, which the city does not pay for or allow unless it's not by contract, which is what we're trying to do here. The difference in the ask, our appraisal comes in for the different kinds of property interests we need, like the fee simple for the widening of the road and the changing of the corner, the permanent easement, which is a slope easement shown in orange. If you can advance that to the drawing. A temporary construction easement that runs the length of the project. It's shown in green.
We need to get to the map.
It's coming. The total appraisal for the city's ask of this property owner was $223,000. The estimate from the property owner, the lawyer for the property owner, who admittedly got this as an estimate for the change in the landscaping, which is a different animal than an appraiser saying what something's worth. And the difference there is $408,802. One other ask that we've made of the property owners that they submit to us an agreement with the HOA that whatever deal we strike covers both entities, so that the city is not susceptible to a challenge by the HOA once we settle this, and they have been unable to reach an agreement. I feel that use of eminent domain in order to keep from delaying the project is what we need to do. Public Works intends to put this bid out next week, so this is urgently needed in order to keep the project moving.
You've heard the remarks of the city attorney. What's the desire of council?
Mayor Paul,
Ms. Mueller.
I move that we approve Agenda Item 2023-273 to approve the appropriation of certain property rights and interests located at 63,000 Glen Oaks Lane, Sandy Springs, Georgia, tax parcel number 17-0071-0007-0506, through the use of eminent domain as it relates to the Mount Vernon Highway Corridor Improvement Project, project number TS-192.
We have a motion by Ms. Mueller. Is there a second? Been moved by Ms. Mueller, seconded by Ms. Rochelle, that we approve Agenda Item 2023-271, approving the appropriation of property rights and interests located at 6300 Glen Oaks Lane in Sandy Springs, Georgia, for the use of the Mount Vernon Highway Corridor Improvement Project. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. The question is on Agenda Item 2023-274, approving the appropriation of certain property rights and interests located at 6300 Glen Oaks Lane in Sandy Springs. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The item is approved. Going to reports. I can see that we have had a Boy Scout who really regrets that he chose tonight to come get his Civics Merit Badge. Thank you for staying through the whole thing. If you need a letter to your Scoutmaster, you call me, all right? You stayed through the whole meeting. Congratulations. A couple of things I need to report. I've been doing a lot of different things lately, not all of them here at City Hall. Had the GMA Legislative Policy Council meeting last week in Mr. Lee's hometown of LaGrange, and we spent a lot of time talking about affordable housing and also about lost. You know, I'm on the task force looking with the county commissioners at a update of the lost and SDS strategy or legislation. We're trying to get another meeting after the ACCG and GMA Legislative Policy Councils met together. We've made a lot of progress, but we still got a lot of work left to do, so we're going to have another meeting to do that probably sometime in October. You heard me quote during the conversation on the child care facilities. The quote that I gave you of 3 million basically women out of the job force, the job market in the state of Georgia alone because of child care issues came from a presentation that was made by Chris Clark, the president of the Georgia Chamber. It was an amazing presentation, and that was just one nugget in a much larger presentation that I've urged the local Chamber of Commerce to get Chris out to do the whole presentation. It takes about an hour to do it. When they do that, I'm going to urge council to show up because it is an amazing look at workforce, not just now, but trends going into the future. And the next 10 years when it comes to workforce availability and people in the workforce is not an optimistic picture. And there are a lot of nuggets in there. Over 40% of our kids graduate from high school with no job experience, which makes it very difficult to find a job if you don't have any job experience. And so there are a lot of things in there that are kind of eye-opening about the state of Georgia and the state of our workforce. And one of the things that came out is we've always been focused on the low end of affordable housing. And this came from a representative from the city of Atlanta, said the problem basically with affordable housing is the lack of luxury housing. And those folks who are building luxury housing are buying up the affordable housing units to be able to transform those into luxury housing. So we've always focused on the low end of how we get more affordable housing without necessarily figuring out how we deal with the folks who have the resources to buy the affordable housing stock in our community and others and replace it with much larger. Not that that's necessarily in totality a bad thing, but it does have real impact on the stock for available affordable housing. Another fact is that an awful lot of people during the last 10 years got 2% mortgage rates, and they're not moving. Because to move, they would have to get 4 times the interest rate. So housing is much more complex and complicated. Amazing statistics on workforce and where we're going to get the resources. Right now, for every 3 job openings, there's just one person looking for a job. And now we're adding thousands of jobs, particularly in the rural areas, and there's no housing there. There's no infrastructure for water, sewer. And so the state's going to have to spend a lot of money over the next few years investing in the ability to support the folks that we need to fill all these jobs. So it's a very complex, complicated economic situation that's going to have a real impact on Sandy Springs and every other community in the state. So when we get that presentation set up, I hope that you'll attend. A couple of meetings that council may be interested in, at least one, the National League of Cities. We're not a member of NLC, we're a member of GMA, but they're meeting in November here in Atlanta, in the Atlanta area, and it may be something you want to take a look at and to participate since they're here. I've worked with NLC for a long time, going back to my days at HUD. Their focus is largely on small, medium, even large cities, but they look at the totality of city issues, so there'll probably be some things that people may want to pick up, and I would encourage you to attend if you're so inclined. And then in October, that's in November, in October, the U.S. Conference of Mayors, under the leadership of Mayor Dickens of Atlanta, is having a conference on P3. And that'll be here in Atlanta. I think you have to be a member of Conference of Mayors to participate. I got an invitation from the Conference of Mayors and then another letter from Mayor Dickens' staff wanting me to participate since Sandy Springs knows a lot about P3. So I'll be probably participating in that meeting as well. So there's been a lot of things going on with a lot of interesting and important information, mostly outside the City Hall, but I think it was important for me to bring you up to speed. Anybody else? Dr. Kelly.
I just wanted to quickly acknowledge our facility staff because there's wheelchair access at the in the parking deck, and I have longed for that with my roller bag. So, thank you very much.
Yeah, I got an earful from a daughter who had a stroller and couldn't open the door, and so I called to tell her that the Jane Paul Memorial door was now available, that she could get William in the City Hall without struggling. So that's something, truthfully, that should have been done from the beginning. So you're right. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Any staff reports? We got the financials, right?
Good evening again. You have the July 2023 unaudited financials before you. We'll just kind of scroll through the first page. We're at 8.33% of the new fiscal year. Revenues are at 5.42 and the expenditures are at 36.25% of the budget. We can go to page 2. Page 2 represents the cash balances in each of our bank accounts. As of the close of July 2023, we earned 5.21% interest through Georgia Fund 1 and approximately 4.40% interest on the average account balances through Truist. Page 3, although we don't have any activity for 2024, this represents the trends of local option sales taxes. collected over the last 5 years. The expenditures which follow this page are as expected. We are just 1 month into this fiscal year, and they are slowly but surely occurring. This concludes the financial report for July 2023.
Any questions of the Chief Financial Officer? Mr.
Mayor Paul,
Paulson.
so when are we going to close out 2022-23? We should be pretty close, right?
The official audit start date is September 25th. So we are ready for them to come and wrap it up.
Okay, thanks.
Mayor?
Mr. Baumann.
Going to be a recurring question. What is the investment income last month? The amount of investment income, was that on there?
It's not listed. It's not listed here. I will have to
Just
look
bring
at
that
the
to us
system.
every month.
Okay.
Yeah.
She gave us the.
No, just give us the percentages.
I give the interest rate that we earned, but I didn't tell them the amount.
Yeah, no, I want to hear the
I want to
amounts.
see the
though.
amount of interest earned.
Yeah.
I can bring that, and that's no problem.
Anybody else? All right. We do need an executive session
Mayor Paul.
for real estate and litigation.
I
Mr.
move that
Paulson.
we suspend regular order, move into executive session for the purposes of real estate and litigation.
Motion by Mr. Paulson. Is there a second? Been moved by Mr. Paulson, seconded by Mr. DiGiulio, that we suspend regular order and go into executive session for the purposes of real estate and litigation. Any discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. The question's on suspending regular order. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. We are in executive session, 8:45 p.m.
City council that's employed as Dr. Kelly. you out of here. We'll see. We'll see John there next week. He's still behind the curtains.
Mayor Paul.
Mr. Paulson.
1, 2, 3, 4. I move that we close out executive session and move back to regular order.
We have a motion by Mr. Paulson to suspend the executive session and return to regular order. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved by Mr. Paulson, seconded by Mr. DiGiulio. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, we'll call the question. The question's on returning to regular order. All in favor of the motion, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. We're back in regular order. Mr.
Mr.
DiGiulio.
Mayor, I move adjournment.
Mr. DiGiulio moves adjournment, seconded by Mr. Paulson. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. We are adjourned. At 6
The
p.m.
latest, except for the very first meeting on December 1st, 2005. This is the latest we've ever started a meeting.
You're right.
I know.